Somewhere far from here, in a country of dark forests and colder mountains, there stands a tall gray tower that the wind has never fully quieted. It was built to hold a prisoner, and for many long years it did, and the snow gathered on its narrow ledges the way snow gathers on things the world would rather forget. Tonight, as you settle into the warmth of your bed and let the day loosen its hold on you, imagine that tower standing patient in the dark. Imagine, too, far away on another stretch of enchanted ground, a great school with lit windows, and beyond it a graveyard where a small village keeps its old sorrows. Two places, two silences, and running between them like a thread of black water. The memory of two names. History, even the hidden history of wizards, remembers very few names above all the rest. Tonight, we will hold two of them gently up to the light. Before we begin to weigh them, let me say one soft thing to you. This is a quiet channel made for people who lie awake when the rest of the house has gone still, for the ones who watch the ceiling and wait for their thoughts to slow. If these long, calm stories help you drift off, you can help the channel by subscribing, so that the next tired soul searching in the dark for something to soothe them will find their way here too. That is all. No noise, no rush, only a small kindness that costs you nothing and lets this quiet place keep breathing. And now, with that gently done, let us return to the two names and the long question that gathers around them like mist around a tower. For tonight we are going to do something unusual and slow. We are going to set two of the darkest wizards who ever lived side by side. And we are going to ask, without any heat at all, which of them was truly the more powerful. On one side stands Lord Voldemort, the wizard whose name grew so heavy with dread that a whole country stopped daring to speak it aloud. On the other stands Gellert Grindelwald, the brilliant and beautiful ruin of a man who, a generation earlier, very nearly reshaped the world with nothing but a vision and the force of his own certainty. They never truly faced each other in the fullness of their strength. Their lives overlapped only at the very edges, one rising as the other lay chained. And so the duel we hold tonight is not a duel of wands at all, but a duel of memory, weighed out slowly in the dark, the way you might turn two smooth stones over and over in your hand to feel which one sits heavier. I want you to picture it exactly like that. Two stones, cool and dark, resting in an open palm. One is Voldemort, and it is heavy with a cold that seems to come from somewhere beneath the world. The other is Grindelwald, and it is lighter to the touch, but it catches the light in a way that draws the eye and will not let it go. Which one is heavier? You cannot always tell by looking. Sometimes you must simply hold them a long while and let the weight declare itself. That is what we will do across this long night, unhurried, in no contest to win, only to understand. There is no wrong answer waiting to catch you out, and there is nothing you must decide before you sleep. If your mind wanders off somewhere warm and loses the thread entirely, that is perfectly well. The weighing will still be here, turning gently, and you can drift back into it whenever you please, or not at all. There are many ways to measure a wizard, and we will move through them one at a time, so there is nothing for you to chase and nothing for you to solve. We will look first at where each of them came from, at the very different roads that carried two gifted boys down into the same darkness. Grindelwald came from brilliance and charm, expelled from his school for going too far, too fast, too hungry to be stopped. Voldemort came from a loveless beginning, an orphan with cold and clever eyes, and the blood of Salazar Slytherin running quietly in his veins. Two very different sorrows. Two very different hungers. Then we will weigh their raw magical power, the sheer strength that lived in their hands. Both were prodigies of a kind the world sees perhaps once in a century. And yet they were prodigies in different keys. Voldemort pressed magic to its most extreme and forbidden edges, and left behind feats that were written down and remembered with horror. Grindelwald's power glows more like a legend than a ledger, dazzling and half in shadow, spoken of in awe more than recorded in detail. To weigh them fairly, we will have to be honest about what we truly know and what we only imagine. We will linger on dueling, for here the ground shifts. Grindelwald was called, by those who would know, one of the greatest duelists who ever lived, and when he fell at last, it was in a contest so tremendous that it is still named the greatest duel in wizarding history. Voldemort, too, was a terror with a wand in his hand, who fought the mightiest wizard of his age to a standstill and struck down enemies without mercy. On this one narrow ground, with a certain wand in his grip, Grindelwald may just lean ahead, and we will feel out that leaning slowly. We will consider their followers and their reach, for a dark wizard is never only himself. Grindelwald gathered nations to him with a vision and a gleaming promise, a movement that spread across a whole continent under the banner of a single seductive idea. Voldemort ruled through terror and through a circle of fanatics bound to him by fear and by twisted devotion, and his grip upon his own country was more absolute and more suffocating than anything Grindelwald ever cared to build. Breadth against depth. A wide, cold tide against a narrow, drowning one. We will sit with fear itself, that strange currency of power, and notice how differently the two men were feared. Grindelwald was dreaded, yes, but he was also admired, even loved, by those who wished to believe him. Voldemort inspired no such warmth. He was pure dread, a name struck out of ordinary speech, a shape people would not describe for fear that describing it might summon it. And running through all of it, binding the two lives together across the years, we will follow a single slender wand of elderwood, the most dangerous wand ever made. Grindelwald won it, and wielded it as though it had always been his. Voldemort hunted it, seized it, and never once truly held it, because its loyalty was quietly elsewhere the whole time. That difference, so small and so total, may tell us more about power than any duel could. We will look, near the end, at what each man wanted, for that too is a kind of power and a kind of doom. Grindelwald wanted to remake the world into a new order of his own design. Voldemort wanted only to never die, and to rule whatever remained forever. One reached outward toward a terrible dream. The other reached inward, clutching at his own endless life. And we will close by watching how each of them fell, for both were undone in the end by the one thing each could not bring himself to understand. So there is our long, quiet path through the night. Origins and rise, raw magic, dueling, followers, fear, the Elder Wand, ideology, the strange dream of never dying, and the manner of each downfall. You do not need to hold any of it. You do not need to keep score. I will carry the weighing for you, slow and even, and all you must do is breathe and sink a little deeper into the warmth around you, and let the two names drift through your mind like snow settling on that far gray tower and on the dark towers of another cruel and clever man. We begin, as all these stories should begin, at the beginning, with a golden-haired boy who was clever beyond measure, and already, even then, a little too fond of the shadows he could make. Let us begin with Grindelwald, because he came first, a full generation before the other, into a world that had not yet learned to fear him. Picture, if you like, a school set high in the north of Europe, in a country of pine and snow and long gray winters. A school whose very location was kept a secret so that its rivals could never find it. This was Durmstrang, an old and formidable place, famous even among the great wizarding schools for how deeply it was willing to teach the darker branches of magic. Other schools spoke of the dark arts only to warn against them. Durmstrang, it was whispered, taught them outright, as though they were simply another subject to be mastered. And that reputation drew a certain kind of student, hungry and unafraid, up into its cold halls. It was here that a boy named Gellert Grindelwald came to learn, and here that he first began to be spoken of, quietly at first, and then not quietly at all. He was, by every account that survives, extraordinary. Not merely clever, though he was that, but brilliant in a way that seemed to bend the room toward him. Teachers found their attention caught by him against their will. Other students, older and prouder, felt themselves drawn into his orbit as though he carried some small private sun about with him. He learned quickly, dangerously quickly, and what he learned he did not keep tidily in its place. He reached for more, always more, and in particular he reached toward the darker corners of magic that even Durmstrang preferred to leave in shadow. And here is the thing about young Grindelwald that we should hold gently as we weigh him. His gift was never only in his wand. It lived just as much in his face, in his voice, in the strange magnetism that made people want to believe whatever he told them. There are wizards who are powerful the way a storm is powerful, all force and no persuasion. Grindelwald was powerful the way a beautiful idea is powerful, the kind that slips past your defenses because part of you wishes it were true. He won followers, even as a schoolboy, not by frightening them, but by charming them, by making them feel chosen, by hinting at a future so bright and so bold that to refuse it felt like cowardice. That, more than any single curse, was the shape of his power from the very start. Think for a moment of the difference between a wizard who can knock down a wall and a wizard who can convince you to knock it down yourself, gladly, believing it was your own idea all along. The first is strong. The second is something far rarer and far more frightening. And Grindelwald was the second kind from his earliest days, long before he ever held a wand worth fearing. People did not merely obey him. They wanted to. They left his company feeling larger than before, lit from within by his certainty, and they carried that borrowed fire back out into their own lives. But brilliance without a boundary is a dangerous thing, and Grindelwald had no interest in boundaries. He began to conduct experiments, twisted and reckless ones, the exact nature of which the histories are careful to leave vague, as though even to describe them plainly would be to give them a foothold. Whatever they were, they crossed a line that even Durmstrang, that most permissive of schools, could not allow to stand. And so a thing happened that almost never happened at such a place. Gellert Grindelwald, the most gifted student anyone there could remember, was expelled. He was cast out, sent away, marked before he had even truly begun as a young man who could not be trusted to stop. Now, an ordinary boy so disgraced might have crept home to hide his shame. Grindelwald did no such thing. Expulsion did not humble him. If anything, it freed him, for it cut away the last thin thread of authority that had ever pretended to hold him. He carried himself out of that school not as a failure, but as a young man too large for the cage they had tried to keep him in, and he went out into the world already certain that the world was too small for him and would have to be made larger to fit. His travels carried him, in time, to a quiet corner of England, to a small village of stone cottages and old stories called Godric's Hollow. It was not a place where one expected the fate of nations to be decided. It was a soft and ordinary sort of village, with a churchyard and a market square and the slow rhythm of country life. But it happened that Grindelwald had a great-aunt living there, an old woman named Bathilda, who was a noted historian of magic, and it was to her house that he came to stay for a summer. And it happened, too, that in that same small village there lived another young man of extraordinary gifts, a young man who would one day be called the greatest wizard of his age. His name was Albus Dumbledore. I want you to hold this meeting gently, because so much turns upon it, and because there is a real sadness in it that runs beneath everything that came after. Dumbledore, in that summer, was not yet the serene old man of white beard and half-moon glasses that the world would later know. He was young, and he was grieving, and he was trapped. His father was in prison. His mother had recently died. He had been left to care for a fragile younger sister named Ariana and a resentful younger brother. And he felt his own great talents rusting unused in that small village while lesser men went off to see the world. He was lonely in the particular way that brilliant people are lonely, aching for a single mind that could keep pace with his own. And then, into that ache, walked Gellert Grindelwald. The two of them met, and it was, for both, like a door opening onto a room they had each despaired of ever finding. Here at last was an equal. Here was someone who understood, who thought as fast, who dreamed as large, who did not flinch from ideas that would have frightened smaller souls. They talked, and they talked, through long summer days and longer nights, letters flying between them even when they had only just parted. Two young geniuses igniting each other into a blaze that neither could have made alone. For a brief and shining while, before we come to any of the darkness, it was simply a friendship of a rare and intoxicating kind, the meeting of two minds that recognized themselves in each other. But you already feel the shadow in it, because you know where it leads. Grindelwald did not bring only his brilliance to that friendship. He brought his hunger and his certainty and the beginnings of a terrible idea, and he poured them into a young man who was grieving and gifted and just proud enough to listen. What began as friendship began, almost at once, to curdle into something else. A shared dream that wore the mask of nobility while hiding a will to power beneath it. And that is where we must leave them tonight, in that summer, in that village, at the very hinge of everything. Two young men leaning close over their letters and their plans, one of them already reaching, quietly, toward a slogan that would one day be carved above the gate of a prison. For now, though, simply hold the picture of the young Grindelwald as we have drawn him, because it matters for the weighing that is to come. He was not, at first, a creature of terror. He did not begin by making people afraid. He began by making them believe. He was expelled not for cruelty, but for reaching too far, and he rose not through fear, but through the far rarer and more dangerous gift of being adored. Remember that, softly, as you drift, because it is the first true difference between him and the other name we are holding tonight. One of these dark wizards was feared. The other, first and always, was loved by those he ruined, and that made him powerful in a way that has nothing to do with the strength of any curse. Rest now, and let that young golden figure fade back into his summer, and we will follow, gently, where his dream carried him next. And so we return to that summer in Godric's Hollow, to the two young men bent close over their letters, and to the idea that was slowly taking shape between them. Every movement that ever swept across the world began, at some point, as a few quiet words spoken between friends, and this one was no different. What Grindelwald and the young Dumbledore dreamed together was, in its way, breathtaking, and that is precisely what made it so dangerous. They did not dream of cruelty for its own sake. They dreamed of order. They looked at a world in which wizards hid themselves away in fear, forced into secrecy, forbidden from ever showing their gifts to the vast ordinary population of Muggles who outnumbered them so greatly. And they asked why. Why should the strong hide from the weak? Why should those who could do so much bow their heads and pretend to be less? Out of that question grew the dream, and out of the dream grew a slogan. 3 small words that Grindelwald would carry for the rest of his life like a banner and like a wound. For the greater good. That was the phrase, gentle and reasonable on its surface, and beneath its softness lay a vision of wizards stepping out of the shadows to rule over the Muggle world, not as tyrants, they told themselves, but as benevolent guardians, wise shepherds guiding a flock too foolish to guide itself. They would end the hiding. They would end the fear. They would take charge, for everyone's sake, for the greater good. And if some had to be ruled against their will, well, that was only because they did not yet understand how much better their lives would be. You can hear, even now, how seductive it was, and how rotten at its core. The truly dangerous ideas are never the ugly ones, for the ugly ones announce themselves and can be turned away at the door. The dangerous ones are the ones that arrive wearing the face of virtue, that ask you to be brave and generous and wise, that make the terrible thing feel like the responsible thing. For the greater good is exactly such a phrase. It does not ask you to be cruel. It asks you to be strong enough to do what must be done, and it lets you believe, all the while, that your heart is in the right place. That is why so many gentle and ordinary people found themselves carried along by it, and why it took so very long for the world to see the horror hiding inside the kindness. That is the particular horror of Grindelwald's idea. It did not announce itself as evil. It came dressed as kindness. It offered its followers not guilt but purpose, not shame but a noble mission, and that is why it spread as it did, and why even a mind as great as Dumbledore's was, for one terrible summer, swept up in it. For a while, the 2 young men planned it all in earnest, imagined themselves at the head of a new world, dreamed of finding the fabled objects of power that might make such a conquest possible. It was, for that brief span, the most exhilarating thing either of them had ever known, and Dumbledore would confess, many years later and with deep sorrow, how completely it had caught him. But every dream is tested against the hard edges of real life, and this one was tested cruelly over the fate of a single fragile girl. You will remember that Dumbledore had a younger sister named Ariana. She had been harmed as a small child, harmed in a way that damaged her magic and left her frightened and unstable, unable to control the power that flickered dangerously inside her. She needed gentleness. She needed patience. She needed a brother who would stay and care for her, and that duty sat like a stone across the bright road that Grindelwald was painting. For if Dumbledore was to go out and remake the world, what was to be done with the sister who could not go with him? It was the brother, the other brother, Aberforth, who forced the question into the open, for he loved Ariana fiercely and saw clearly what the 2 dreamers refused to see, that their grand vision had no room in it for a girl who needed only to be protected. And so, in the small house in Godric's Hollow, the beautiful friendship broke. Words were said, wands were drawn. 3 young men, all of them furious and frightened, fell into a duel there in that cottage, spells flying wildly in the close air, and into the middle of that chaos stepped the very person none of them had meant to harm. When the light and the fury cleared, Ariana lay dead upon the floor. No one ever knew whose curse had struck her. That was the cruelest part of all, and the part that would haunt Dumbledore for the rest of his long life. It might have been Aberforth's. It might have been Grindelwald's. It might, and this was the thought he could never lay to rest, have been his own. In the space of a single terrible moment, the golden dream lay in ruins with a young girl's body at its heart, and everything that the two friends had built together was poisoned past saving. Grindelwald did what Grindelwald always did when a place grew too small or too painful to hold him. He fled. He left Godric's Hollow and its grief behind him and vanished into Europe. And he did not look back, and he did not slow down. Here the two roads that had run together for one summer split forever. Dumbledore stayed behind with his guilt and his grief and turned, slowly and painfully, away from the dream of power, learning through the worst kind of lesson to distrust the hunger that had nearly consumed him. That is why, in later years, he would refuse again and again the offices and the authority that others begged him to take. He had felt in himself how sweet power could taste, and it had cost his sister her life, and he never trusted himself with it again. Grindelwald learned the opposite lesson, or rather, he learned no lesson at all. The death of Ariana did not turn him from the dream. It only cut away the one companion who might, in time, have softened him and left him free to pursue for the greater good alone, unchecked by any friendship, answerable to no one. And pursue it he did. Across the years that followed, Grindelwald built his idea into a movement, and the movement into a rising power that spread across the whole of magical Europe. He did not conquer with armies at first. He conquered with the idea, with speeches and visions, and that same magnetic charm that had won him followers as a boy, now grown vast and practiced and terrible. He gathered the disaffected and the ambitious, the true believers and the merely frightened, and he wove them into something that no single country's authorities could easily stop. Wizards who would never have thought of themselves as cruel found themselves marching, quietly and then openly, beneath his banner, telling themselves all the while that they served a noble cause. This is the thing to carry with you into sleep tonight, the deep difference between Grindelwald's rise and the rise of the other name we are weighing. Grindelwald did not need to make people afraid in order to rule them. He made them agree. He made them want what he wanted. He offered a whole continent a story about itself so flattering and so grand that people handed him their loyalty gladly. And a tyrant who is loved is a far harder thing to unseat than a tyrant who is merely feared. His power was never only in his wand or in the terrible objects he would later hunt down. His deepest power was in his voice, in the dream, in 3 soft words that turned ordinary people into willing instruments of conquest. So let him rise there, gently, in your mind, across the map of a dark and troubled century, a golden figure at the head of a growing tide, still telling himself and everyone who would listen that all of it, every cruelty, every conquest, every fresh grave, was only ever for the greater good. Rest there a while. In the next quiet stretch, we will follow that tide to its height, to the wand he stole, the fortress he raised, and the terror he became, before the greatest wizard of the age at last came to find him. Now we come to the height of Grindelwald's power, and to the darker instruments that carried him there, and we will walk through them slowly, the way you might walk through a great cold hall by candlelight, letting your eyes adjust to each shape before moving on to the next. For a movement, however seductive, is not enough on its own. A man who wishes to rule a continent wants more than a beautiful idea. He wants power he can hold in his hand, and Grindelwald, who had dreamed since boyhood of the fabled objects of ultimate magic, set out to claim the greatest of them all. There is an old legend among wizards of 3 objects, the Deathly Hallows, gifts said to have been given long ago to 3 brothers by death itself. A stone to call back the dead, a cloak to hide from all eyes, and a wand that could not be beaten in any duel. Most wizards took the tale for a children's story, a fable to frighten and delight. Grindelwald took it for a map. He believed, and he hungered above all for the third gift, the wand. The one they called the Elder Wand, the Death Stick, the Wand of Destiny, said to have passed down a long bloody river of history from one master to the next, always by conquest, always by the defeat of the wizard who held it before. And Grindelwald found it. He learned that it rested in the possession of a celebrated wandmaker named Grigorovich, and he went to him. And by cunning and by force he took the Elder Wand for his own. From that day, he carried in his hand the most dangerous wand ever known to have existed. A wand whose loyalty he had won in the only way it could be won, by overcoming the one who held it. And here we must be careful and fair in our weighing, because this is the single fact that lifts Grindelwald so high in the reckoning of pure power. With the Elder Wand truly his, its allegiance genuinely bent toward him, he became very nearly unbeatable in a duel. Not through trickery, not through borrowed strength, but as the rightful master of the most powerful wand in the world. That is a height that almost no wizard in all of history ever reached. Hold that carefully, because it will matter greatly later, when we set his grip upon the wand beside the grip of the other man who would one day covet it. There is a whole world of difference between holding a thing and owning it, and Grindelwald, in these years, truly owned it. But do not imagine that the wand made him. The wand only sharpened what was already there. By every account, Grindelwald was among the most gifted duelists who had ever lived. Elegant and merciless and impossibly fast, and the wand set that gift into a frame of gold. In the films that tell of his early years, there are glimpses of other powers too, of a strange gift for seeing the shapes of things to come, of a blue and hungry fire he could raise and command, a curse of protective flame that answered only to his will. These are the more contested and shadowy edges of his legend, and we hold them lightly, but they add to the picture of a wizard whose power seemed to reach in directions few others could follow. Whatever the precise truth beneath the legend, this much is certain. Where Grindelwald walked, the ground itself seemed to tilt toward him. With the wand in his hand and the movement at his back, his reins spread and darkened. The seductive dreamer of the early years hardened, over time, into something colder and more absolute. The charm remained, but beneath it the iron showed through. He built himself a fortress, high and grim in the mountains, a prison called Nurmengard, raised to hold those who dared to oppose him. Above its gate he carved those same 3 words that had begun it all, for the greater good, so that every enemy dragged through that gate would pass beneath the slogan that had justified their ruin. There is something terribly telling in that. He did not hide the phrase in shame. He set it in stone over a prison, still believing, or still needing others to believe, that the cruelty served the cause. And the terror spread. Across the continent his name grew heavy and dark, and the years of his rise ran alongside the great and terrible Muggle wars of that same century, so that it can be hard, looking back, to tell where one darkness ended and the other began. It was as though the wizarding world had its own vast catastrophe unfolding in the shadow of the Muggle one, a rising tide of fear and conquest with Grindelwald's golden figure at its crest. He was, for a time, the most dangerous wizard alive, feared across borders, hunted by governments who could not catch him, adored by followers who would have died for the dream. Yet here is the strange and important truth of his terror, the thing that keeps him forever different from the other name we are weighing. Grindelwald was feared, yes, deeply feared, but he was never only feared. Even at the height of his cruelty he remained, to a great many, magnetic and even admirable, a man whose vision drew people toward him rather than driving them away. His was the terror of a leader people longed to follow, not the terror of a monster people longed only to escape. He wanted to be understood. He wanted to be believed. He wanted, in some deep way, to be right, and to have the world agree that he was right. That hunger for agreement, for adoration, is the fingerprint of Grindelwald upon everything he built, and it is worth holding beside the very different hunger we will find in Voldemort, who wanted no one to love him and cared only that everyone should be afraid. For all its height, though, his reign could not last, because there was one wizard in the world he could not simply charm or overpower. One old friend from a summer long ago who had spent the years since learning, painfully, to be strong. For a long time, Dumbledore held back out of grief and dread and the terrible fear of what he might learn about that night in Godric's Hollow, if the two of them ever truly faced each other. But at last, in the year 1945, with the world in ruins and the terror grown unbearable, he could hold back no longer. The two of them met, the greatest wizard of the age against the master of the Elder Wand, and they fought a duel so vast and so tremendous that it is remembered still as the greatest duel in all of wizarding history. We will sit with that duel more fully when we come to weigh the two men as duelists, for it deserves its own quiet hour. For tonight it is enough to know how it ended. Grindelwald was beaten. The unbeatable wand did not save him. He was taken, and he was cast into Nurmengard, the very fortress he had raised, imprisoned beneath his own carved words for the long years that remained to him. So there he sits at the close of his story, an old man in a high cold cell, the golden dream long since turned to ash, the movement scattered, the wand carried off by the friend who had loved him and defeated him. And yet, even here, even at the very end, there is one last thing to hold, a thing we will return to, because it complicates everything. When darkness came knocking at Nurmengard many years later, when another dark wizard climbed to that cell hunting the Elder Wand, the aged and unarmed Grindelwald did not cower and did not betray. He defied his visitor, and he paid for that defiance with his life, and there is in that final act a strange flicker of courage that sits oddly and unforgettably against all the cruelty that came before. Rest now on that image, the old prisoner in the tower, the snow at the window, the last defiance still to come. We have weighed the first of our two dark stones from beginning to end. When you wake to the next quiet chapter, we will take up the other and meet the loveless orphan who became the terror called Voldemort. Now let us turn the second stone over in the hand, slowly, and look at the other of the two dark names we are weighing tonight. If Gellert Grindelwald was born of vision and charm and a dream of a remade world, the wizard we come to now was born of something colder and lonelier, and his darkness grew from a different soil entirely. His name, before it became a name that frightened a whole country, was simply Tom Marvolo Riddle. And to understand the terror he would one day become, we begin far from any castle or any throne, in a plain little room in a London orphanage, on the last day of a bleak December in the winter of 1926. His story truly begins even before that, in a poor and crumbling house in a village called Little Hangleton, where a strange and unhappy family called the Gaunts lived out the last of a proud and ruined line. They were the descendants of Salazar Slytherin himself, one of the four who long ago founded the school at Hogwarts, and they clung to that ancient blood the way a starving man clings to the memory of a feast. They had almost nothing left, only their pride, a small gold locket, a ring, and the rare and secret gift of speaking to serpents, the tongue called Parseltome, passed down through the centuries in their veins. In that grim house lived a daughter named Merope, quiet and beaten down and overlooked, and it was she who would become the mother of the boy we are following tonight. Merope fell in love, hopelessly and from a distance, with a handsome muggle named Tom Riddle, the son of the grand family in the big house on the hill. He did not love her. He barely saw her. And so, when her cruel father and brother were taken away by the law, and Merope was at last left alone and free, she reached for the only power she had. Whether by a love potion brewed in secret, or by some gentler enchantment, she bewitched the young man into loving her, and the two of them ran away together. For a little while she must have been happy. But Merope, carrying his child, made a fateful and heartbroken choice. She stopped the magic. She wanted to be loved for herself, truly and freely, and she gambled that by now he might stay. He did not stay. The spell broken, the Muggle Tom Riddle looked at the plain, poor, strange woman he had married, and he felt only horror, and he left her, and he never looked back. And so Merope, abandoned and penniless in a great gray city, wandered until she found her way to the door of an orphanage. There, on the very edge of the new year, she gave birth to a son. She lived just long enough to name him. She asked that he be called Tom, after the father who had cast her aside, and Marvolo, after her own father, and Riddle for the family name. Then, worn out and without the will to live, Merope Gaunt died, and the baby was left behind, one small child among many, in a place that knew nothing of the ancient blood that ran in him. It is worth pausing on this, gently, as you rest. The most feared dark wizard of the age began his life exactly as Grindelwald did not. Not adored, not gathered up by a movement, not the center of anything, simply an unwanted infant, unloved, with a dead mother and a father who had thrown him away before he was ever born. The boy grew up in that orphanage, and even as a small child there was something wrong and something remarkable about him at once. The woman who ran the place, a tired and decent matron named Mrs. Cole, remembered him with a shiver. He was clever, far too clever, and cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. Strange things happened around him that no one could explain. A rabbit belonging to another child was found hanging from the rafters. 2 children who had crossed him on a seaside trip came back from a dark cave silent and shaking, and would never afterward say what had happened inside. Small objects went missing, and were found hidden in Tom's cupboard, little trophies taken from the children he had frightened or hurt. He liked to make things happen by his will alone, to move things without touching them, to make animals do as he wished, and above all he liked to make other children afraid. He had learned already, very young, that fear was a kind of power, and that power was the one thing in the world worth having. Then, on a summer day when the boy was 11, a visitor came to the orphanage, a tall man with auburn hair and a long velvet suit and eyes that saw a great deal. It was Albus Dumbledore, then a teacher at Hogwarts, come to tell the child that he was a wizard and that there was a school for such as him. And here we see the boy clearly for the first time. He was not amazed, not humble, not grateful. He was proud and hungry and secretive. He confessed, almost boasting, to the strange, cruel things he could do, to the way he could hurt those who angered him. Dumbledore looked at that pride and that hunger and that hidden violence, and he did not trust the boy, and he was right not to. Something in Tom Riddle recoiled from the idea that anyone had power over him, and he never forgave the world for the years it had left him unwanted. He came to Hogwarts, and he was sorted, of course, into Slytherin, the house of his distant and terrible ancestor. And there he became something the school had rarely seen. He was, on the surface, the perfect student. Charming when he chose to be, brilliant beyond his years, polished and polite and quick, admired by his teachers and trusted by nearly all of them. He collected people the way he had once collected trophies, gathering around himself a circle of followers who would one day become the first of the Death Eaters. He learned everything the school could teach him, and then went hunting for the things it would not. Only a very few, Dumbledore chief among them, ever saw the cold thing moving beneath the charming boy. For beneath that bright surface, Tom Riddle was searching. He was searching for who he truly was, for the blood that made him special, and above all for a way to make himself more than the mortal, forgettable child the world had tried to throw away. He found his answer in his mother's line. In his second year, he discovered the truth of his heritage, that he was the last living heir of Salazar Slytherin, a Parselmouth, able to speak to snakes as his ancestors had. And he found, hidden deep beneath the castle, the chamber of secrets that Slytherin had built long ago, and the monstrous serpent that slept within it. He opened that chamber, and he set the creature loose, and a girl died. And Tom Riddle framed another boy for the crime, and was thanked for his help in catching the supposed culprit. He was 15 years old. Already he had killed, in a fashion, and already he had learned that he could turn the deaths of others into ladders for his own advancement, and feel nothing at all. And somewhere in those years, he did a thing that told the whole shape of what was coming. He took the name his father had given him, the ordinary Muggle name, Tom Marvolo Riddle, the name of the man who had abandoned his mother, and he rearranged its letters into something new. Out of those same letters, he built the words that would one day be whispered in terror across all of Britain, the title Lord Voldemort. He cast off the father, cast off the boy, cast off the plain and pitiful beginning, and made himself, by an act of pure and icy will, into something he believed no one would ever again dare to overlook. And so, quietly, without a single soul yet knowing what had been born, the orphan of that London winter set out upon the long, dark road that we will follow into the night. There is at the heart of this dark wizard one fear so large that it shaped everything else about him, and it is the fear we come to now, softly, as the night deepens. Where Gellert Grindelwald dreamed of remaking the world and reached for the Deathly Hallows as tools for that grand design, the wizard who called himself Lord Voldemort dreamed of something at once smaller and more monstrous. He wanted, above all things, to never die. Death was the one enemy he could not charm, could not frighten, could not outwit by cleverness alone, and from his earliest years it filled him with a horror so deep and so private that he would do anything, sacrifice anything, unmake any part of himself, in order to escape it. And so tonight, we follow him into the darkest magic that has ever been named, the magic of the Horcrux, and the slow, terrible unmaking of his own soul. To understand what he did, you must first understand what a Horcrux is, and why it is spoken of, when it is spoken of at all, only in whispers and behind locked doors. There is in the deepest and cruelest branches of magic a way for a wizard to hide a fragment of his own soul outside his body, to seal it away inside some object, so that even if his body is destroyed, that hidden piece keeps him tethered to the living world and stops him from truly dying. It sounds, put plainly, almost like a clever trick, a kind of insurance against death. But the price of it is the most unnatural thing in all of magic. For the soul is meant to be whole, and to tear a piece of it away, a wizard must commit the supreme act of evil. He must murder another human being. Murder rips the soul apart, and only then can the torn fragment be captured and hidden. Every Horcrux, therefore, is built upon a killing, and every killing tears the maker a little further from anything human. The young Tom Riddle learned of this magic while he was still a student, coaxing the secret, gently and cunningly, out of a teacher who ought to have known better and who would regret it to the end of his days. It was a small conversation on a quiet evening, the sort of thing that ought to have been forgotten. A clever boy asked a careful question, wrapped in flattery and false innocence, and a proud and trusting teacher, wishing to seem knowledgeable before his most brilliant pupil, said a little more than he should have. That single answer, given lightly and taken greedily, would echo down the decades and cost more lives than any of them could have imagined. And where any other soul might have recoiled in horror, Tom Riddle leaned in. He did not ask whether such a thing could be done once. He asked whether it might be done more than once, whether the soul might be split not merely in two, but again and again, into ever smaller pieces. The very question is a kind of madness, and yet he asked it calmly, with the curiosity of a boy taking apart a watch to see what makes it tick, except that the watch was his own living spirit. He fixed upon a number that pleased him, a number he believed was the most powerfully magical of all, the number 7. He resolved that he would split his soul into 7 pieces, keeping one within his body and hiding the other 6, so that he would be, as near as any wizard had ever come, immortal. And he chose his hiding places with the same cold pride that had ruled him since childhood. He would not seal his soul in some plain, forgettable trinket. He hunted instead for objects of history and beauty and power, relics that meant something, treasures worthy of him. He took his mother's family ring, the ring of the Gaunts with the strange black stone, and made it a Horcrux, killing his own Muggle father and his father's parents to do it, so that the man who had abandoned Merope paid at last with his life for a crime he never understood. He took a beautiful old diary, a plain little book, and poured into it the memory and the soul piece of his 16-year-old self, so that even a fragment of him could think and speak and act on its own. He hunted down the relics of the founders of Hogwarts, the treasures of the great witches and wizards of long ago, a golden locket that had belonged to Salazar Slytherin himself, a small jeweled cup that had belonged to Helga Hufflepuff, a lost diadem that had once been Rowena Ravenclaw's. Each of these he claimed, often through theft and murder, and into each he sealed away another torn shard of himself. There is something worth resting on here, in the quiet, because it is the very center of what makes this wizard different from the other we are weighing. With each murder, with each new Horcrux, he grew stronger against death and weaker as a living soul. His face, which had once been the handsome face of a charming young man, slowly stopped being a human face at all. The nose flattened and thinned until it was little more than 2 slits like a serpent's. The skin went pale and waxen, the eyes turned red. He became less like a man and more like the snakes he could speak to, colder, stranger, further from anything that could love or be loved. He believed he was making himself invincible. In truth, he was hollowing himself out, trading everything soft and human within him for the single hard promise that he would not die. It is a terrible bargain, and he made it over, and never once, in all his long years, did he regret it or understand it. By the time he had done his work, he had made not 6, but, without fully knowing it, 7 fragments hidden in the world, and one more besides that he never intended. For his great serpent, the enormous snake called Nagini, who followed him always in his later years, became a living Horcrux, a soul piece housed not in cold metal or old parchment, but in a warm and breathing creature, bound to him more closely than any object could be. And this splitting into so many pieces made him, in the plainest terms, almost impossible to kill. To destroy him truly, one would first have to hunt down and destroy every hidden fragment, one by one, scattered and guarded and disguised across the length of the country, before the last piece within his body could be touched at all. This is why, when his body was first destroyed, he did not die. He was torn from his flesh and left as something barely alive, a wisp of spirit, weaker than the weakest ghost, unable to touch or hold or truly act. And yet he did not pass on. The Horcruxes held him. They kept him tethered, drifting and waiting and plotting in the shadows for years, until he could find a way to build himself a body once more and rise again. And that is the strange, dark achievement that we must set carefully on the scale tonight, as fairly and calmly as we can. Grindelwald, for all his vision and all his mastery, never walked this road. He never tore his soul apart. He never sought to cheat death in this way, and there is no sign that he ever wished to. When his end came, he faced it. But Voldemort made himself into something that had, in a sense, defeated death for a time, something that could be scattered and beaten and cast out of its body and still refuse to end. In the whole long history of dark magic, no wizard is known to have made more than a single Horcrux, and even that one act was thought too monstrous to speak of. Voldemort made a handful of them, again and again, casually almost, and in doing so he pushed the darkest magic in the world further than anyone before or since. It did not save him in the end. Nothing so unnatural ever truly saves the one who reaches for it. But it makes him, in raw and terrible accomplishment, a sorcerer who went where no other dared to go. And so we lay that heavy stone upon the scale and let it sink and carry it gently with us into the deeper quiet of the night. Having followed the orphan boy into his cold beginnings and then into the deepest and darkest of his magic, we come now to the wizard in his full and dreadful power, to Lord Voldemort as the world came to know him, and to the reign of fear he built across a whole nation. For a soul so hollowed out and so unnatural, he was, we must admit, even as we shrink from it, extraordinarily gifted, one of the most talented wizards ever to walk the halls of Hogwarts. And that talent, bent entirely toward domination and terror, is a large part of what we weigh tonight. Consider first the raw magic in his hands, for it was prodigious. He was a master of the darkest and most forbidden of the three curses that the wizarding world calls unforgivable, and above all of the last of them, the killing curse, the green light that ends a life instantly and without a wound. He cast it more easily and more often than perhaps any wizard of his age, felling his enemies with a flick and a word, so casual in his cruelty that death followed wherever he walked. But the killing curse was only the sharpest of his weapons. He was deeply learned in curses and jinxes of every kind, in defensive and offensive magic alike, able to hold his own and more against the greatest wizards of his time. He could do a thing that almost no other wizard in all the long history of magic had ever managed, a thing that his followers spoke of in hushed and frightened awe. He could fly, not upon a broomstick, not on the back of some winged creature, but by his own unaided power, his body rising and streaking through the air like a plume of black smoke, wingless and unsupported, moving where he willed. It was a feat thought impossible, a violation of the ordinary limits that bind even great wizards to the ground, and he had made it his own, so that he could pursue his enemies through the open sky and appear where none expected him. Even to those who feared nothing else, the sight of that dark shape rising into the air without a broom was a thing that turned the blood cold. He was, too, a master of the mind, skilled in the twin arts of legilimency and occlumency, able to look into another person and read the thoughts and memories laid bare there, to sense a lie, to feel the shape of a fear or a loyalty hidden behind a calm face. To stand before him and try to deceive him was a desperate and dangerous game, for he could often feel the deception forming. He could plant thoughts and visions, could reach across great distances into a mind linked to his own, could bend and torment and mislead. Few could shut him out, and those who could had trained for years in the hardest of disciplines simply to keep their own thoughts their own. To rule, he did not only need wands and curses. He ruled the inner country of fear itself, the place where people keep their secrets, and he walked there almost as he pleased. And he had the old gift of his mother's line, the tongue of serpents, parcel tongue, and with it a command over creatures that answered to no one else. In his youth, it was the great basilisk beneath the school. In his later years, it was the enormous snake Nagini, who was more to him than any human follower, both weapon and companion, and, though few knew it, a vessel of his very soul. He spoke to snakes as easily as other men speak to friends, and the low, hissing sound of that speech, heard suddenly in a quiet room, was enough to make brave witches and wizards go pale, for it marked him unmistakably as the heir of Slytherin and as something not quite like other men. Around this power he gathered his followers, the Death Eaters. And here again we may hold him up beside Grindelwald and see the difference clearly. Grindelwald drew his followers with a dream, with a vision of a better world under wizard rule, with charm and beauty and the promise of a great cause. Voldemort drew his through fear and hunger and a darker kind of loyalty. Some came for pure blood pride, for his promise to cleanse the wizarding world of those born to Muggle parents, to raise the old families and crush the rest. Some came for power, for the chance to be cruel without punishment, to stand near the source of terror and share in it. And many, in the end, stayed simply because they were more afraid of leaving than of staying. He rewarded loyalty thinly and punished failure without mercy, turning his own curse upon his servants when they displeased him, so that even those closest to him lived in dread. His was not a brotherhood. It was a court ruled by fear, held together by the certainty that the one at its center would destroy anyone who wavered. There is something almost unbearably cold in the way he held them. He gave them no true fellowship and no real trust, only the privilege of standing a little nearer to the source of terror than everyone else. And he let them believe that this nearness made them safe. It never did. He watched them always, weighed their usefulness always, and discarded them without a flicker of feeling the moment their usefulness ran out. To serve him was to live in a strange, dark honor that could turn, in a single moment and without warning, into agony or into death. And still they came, and still they knelt, because he had made himself the one thing in their world that could not be defied and survived. He marked them, branded into the flesh of their arms, the sign he had made his own, a skull with a serpent for a tongue, so that with a touch upon that mark he could summon them from anywhere in the country to his side. And that same sign he cast into the sky above the houses of those he had murdered, the dark mark burning green against the night, so that a family coming home, or a village waking in the dark, would look up and see it hanging over a rooftop and know, before they even reached the door, that death had visited. There is a cold genius in that, in turning a symbol into a scream, in making the very sky an instrument of terror. He understood, as few tyrants ever have, that fear does more work than any army, and he spent his cruelty carefully, so that a single killing would frighten 1,000. His grip upon Britain, at the height of it, was very nearly total. He did not always need to sit upon a visible throne. In his second rise, he worked often in shadow, placing his servants in the Ministry of Magic, seizing the government from within, controlling the newspapers, the schools, the courts, so that the whole society ran according to his will while pretending, for a little while, that all was normal. Families vanished in the night. Neighbors informed on neighbors. Muggle-born witches and wizards were dragged before false trials and stripped of everything. And over it all lay the Great Silence, the thing that tells you more about his power than any single spell. His name became unspeakable. People would not say it. Across the length of the country, in frightened whispers, they called him instead only by soft and fearful phrases, anything rather than the 2 syllables of the name itself, because to speak it aloud felt like inviting the dark to turn and look at you. In his second rise, he even bound a curse to the name, so that any who dared to say it might be found and taken. He had made himself, quite literally, a terror too great to be named, a shadow that a whole nation flinched from in the dark. And so, when we set him upon the scale tonight beside the charismatic wizard of the earlier age, this is the shape of what we place there. Not a beloved leader of a movement, not an idealist with a dream, but a hollow and brilliant sorcerer who could fly without a broom, read the secrets of the mind, command the serpents of the earth, kill with a word, and rule a country not by love or by vision, but by the pure, patient, unrelenting engineering of fear. Whether that makes him the greater of the two is a question we are not yet ready to answer, and need not answer here. For now it is enough to lay him down gently in the mind, this creature of terror and cold genius, and to let the quiet settle over the thought of him as the night carries us onward. Now that we have walked slowly through the lives of both of these dark wizards, we come to the first, and perhaps the most tempting of all the questions we set out to weigh tonight. And we come to it gently, with no wish to hurry. Setting aside their followers and their fear, setting aside their ideas and their downfalls, if we could somehow strip away everything but the pure magic in them, the raw power itself, which of the two burned brighter? Which was, at the deepest and simplest level, the stronger sorcerer? It is a question with no scale to measure it, no number to settle it, and yet it is a fair and pleasant thing to turn over slowly in the quiet. And tonight we begin that weighing with the wizard we have just left behind us, Lord Voldemort. Let us first agree on the difficulty of the task, because honesty makes for the softest thinking. Raw magical power is a slippery thing to measure. There is no contest that both men ever entered, no shared trial, no single afternoon on which they stood side by side and cast the same spell so that we might compare the results. They lived a generation apart. They never met in their strength, only once in shadow, near the very end, and that meeting, which we will come to in its proper place, tells us less about raw power than about character. So we cannot simply place them beside one another and read off which flame is taller. Instead, we must do what careful people do when they cannot measure a thing directly. We must look at what each wizard is known to have done, at the feats set down in the record, and reason gently from there. And here, when we look at Voldemort, we find something striking. His feats are not only great, they are unusually well documented, unusually extreme, and unusually strange. Consider again, without hurry, the things he is plainly known to have accomplished. As a boy, before any teacher had shown him a single spell, he could already move objects without touching them, bend animals to his will, and reach into the minds and fears of the other children around him. Untrained, unschooled, a child in an orphanage who had never heard the word magic, he was already doing by raw instinct things that most young witches and wizards cannot manage even after they have been taught. That is the mark of a natural power far above the ordinary, a talent that did not need to be built because it was simply there in him from the first, waiting. Then look at what that talent became when it was fed and trained and sharpened by a will that never rested. He learned to fly, unaided, by his own power alone, a feat so rare that it stands almost without equal in all the long history of wizardkind. Think, as you lie there, on how remarkable that truly is. Wizards for 1,000 years have relied on broomsticks and winged beasts and enchanted carpets and other such crafted things to lift themselves off the ground, precisely because the human body, even a magical one, is not meant to leave the earth on its own. And here was a wizard who cast all of that aside and simply rose, wingless and unsupported, and moved through the open air as though the ordinary rules had been written for lesser men. That single feat alone places him among the most powerful sorcerers ever recorded, for it is not a spell one learns from a book, but an act of raw, overflowing magical strength. Add to that his mastery of the deepest and most demanding magic in the world. The killing curse itself is no small thing to cast, for it demands not only skill, but a genuine and terrible force of will, a true desire to end a life, and most witches and wizards could not manage it even if they wished to. Voldemort cast it as easily as breathing. And beyond the curses lies the darkest achievement of all, the one we walked through in the deep of the night already, the splitting of his soul into many pieces, the making of Horcrux after Horcrux. Set aside for a moment the horror of it and consider only the raw magical difficulty. This is magic so advanced, so unnatural, so far beyond the reach of ordinary sorcery, that in all the centuries no other wizard is known to have made more than a single one, and most who ever learned of it turned away in fear from making even that. Voldemort made a handful, deliberately, again and again. Whatever else we say of him, the raw power required to bend magic itself into such an unnatural shape and to survive the doing of it is almost beyond comparison. It is worth lingering, too, on the sheer breadth of his skill, because power is not only about the largest and most dramatic of feats. It is also about how completely a wizard has mastered the ordinary arts and pushed them beyond their ordinary limits. Voldemort was a duelist who could stand against the greatest wizards of his age and not be overmatched. A maker of enchantments and defenses of frightening cleverness. A wizard who could apparate silently, conjure and vanish and transfigure with an ease that spoke of total command over his craft. He set guardings and traps of terrible ingenuity around the places where he hid his treasures, layering curse upon curse in ways that took the very best minds a long time to unpick. He bent and broke the protective magic of a great school. He wove new terrors out of old spells. This was not a wizard who leaned upon one or two spectacular tricks. This was a wizard fluent in the whole language of magic, from the smallest charm to the darkest curse, and fluent to a degree that few in history have matched. And there is more still, a whole catalog of the extraordinary. He survived the destruction of his own body and lingered for years as a bare fragment of spirit, then engineered his own return to a body of flesh, a resurrection by dark ritual that no ordinary wizard could dream of surviving, let alone designing. He commanded creatures no one else could command, spoke the rare serpent tongue of his ancestors, read minds, planted visions across great distances, and shrugged off spells and injuries that would have finished another wizard many times over. When we lay all of this side by side, feat upon feat, what we notice is not only that Voldemort was powerful, but that his power is written down plainly, event by event, deed by deed, in a long and unmistakable record. We are not guessing at his strength. We are reading it. That is the crucial thing to hold gently in the mind tonight as we begin this weighing, and it is the reason we start with him. When we come, in the quiet that follows, to weigh the power of Gellert Grindelwald, we will find something quite different in shape. We will find a wizard spoken of in the very highest terms, called dangerous and dazzling and brilliant. A a wizard whose power was said to rival that of the greatest of the age. But we will find that much of what we know of him comes to us as reputation, as legend, as the odd words of those who spoke of him afterward, rather than as a long list of documented and catalogued feats, the way Voldemort's is. Grindelwald's power is real, and we will honor it fully. But it lives more in the mist of myth, in the greatness others attributed to him, while Voldemort's lives in the hard, plain record of things he demonstrably did. And so this is where we set the first stone of the weighing to rest for the night, without yet declaring a winner, because the fair weighing is only half done. On the one side we have a wizard whose raw power is not merely enormous, but proven, itemized, extreme, and strange. A wizard who flew without a broom and tore his soul apart and rose from the ruin of his own body. That is a great deal to place upon the scale, and it sinks the pan low. Whether Grindelwald's dazzling and half-legendary power can lift the other pan to meet it, we shall see when we turn to him next. For now, let the mind rest on the sheer, cold, documented enormity of what the orphan boy grew into, on the wingless shape moving through the dark sky, and let that image carry you softly and without fear down into the deeper quiet of the night. And so we turn the second stone over in the hand, slowly, feeling its weight against the first. And we come now to the raw magic of Gellert Grindelwald, which is a stranger thing to weigh than the magic of Lord Voldemort, because so much of it lives in rumor and in awe, rather than in plain and settled record. If Voldemort is a dark wizard whose feats were counted and catalogued, written down almost like a grim and careful ledger, then Grindelwald is a dark wizard remembered the way a storm is remembered by people who lived beneath it. They do not always recall the exact shape of every bolt of lightning. They recall that the sky itself seemed to belong to him for a while, and that when he spoke, the weather of a whole continent seemed to lean toward his voice. That is a different kind of power, and tonight we hold it gently and try to see it clearly. The books tell us that Grindelwald was a prodigy of a rare and dangerous order, brilliant even among the brilliant, expelled at last from Durmstrang, not because he could not keep pace with his lessons, but because his experiments had turned toward things too twisted and too perilous for even that shadowed school to allow beneath its roof. Think for a moment about what that means. Durmstrang was a place already comfortable with the dark arts, a school that did not flinch from teaching the kind of magic other schools would not name. And still, this one young man went so far past the edge of what they would permit that they cast him out. His genius was not the gentle sort. It was a genius that reached hungrily toward power, toward the deep and forbidden mechanisms of the world, and it frightened the very people who had been raised to be unafraid. We know, too, that in his youth, in the quiet summer of Godric's Hollow, he found in the young Albus Dumbledore a mind that could match his own, and this is perhaps the single greatest testament the books give us to his raw brilliance. For Dumbledore, we are told again and again, was the most gifted wizard of his age, perhaps of many ages, and yet when these two boys sat together and dreamed and argued and built their plans by candlelight, they were equals. They spun their theories about the Deathly Hallows, about the reshaping of the world, about power and its uses, and neither one outran the other. To stand as an equal beside the greatest wizard of the century, even for a single shining and terrible summer, is a measure of magical genius that needs no ledger to prove it. You feel it simply by knowing that it happened. Yet here is where the fair weighing asks us to be honest, and honesty is a soft and steady thing that helps the mind settle. The novels, the ones that follow Harry through his years, do not show us Grindelwald in his full and dreadful flower. By the time we meet him in those pages, he is already old, already fallen, already locked in the topmost cell of the very fortress he once built to hold his enemies. We hear of his power. We do not watch it unfold. The great deeds of his reign belong to a time before the story we are given, and so they reach us softened by distance, wrapped in the gauze of legend, spoken of the way one speaks of a war that ended before one was born. And legend, gentle listener, has a way of growing brighter and vaguer the further it travels from the thing itself. The Fantastic Beasts films tried to give that legend a face and a set of hands, and they showed us a Grindelwald who could do wondrous and frightening things, who could bend crowds with a soft and reasonable voice, who could raise a ring of blue fire that answered only to those loyal to him and consumed the rest, who seemed at times to glimpse the shape of the future in visions. And these images are beautiful and eerie, and they suit him. But we must hold them lightly, the way the storyteller was asked to hold all contested things, because the films recast and revised him more than once, and reshaped his history. And where they and the older canon disagree, we lean back toward the books and the writings that came first, and we speak of the rest in soft, uncommitted tones. So we will say only this much and no more. In every telling, Grindelwald is a wizard of dazzling and unusual gifts, and even the most careful account leaves us certain that his raw power was extraordinary. What we cannot always do is lay it out in the neat and countable way we could lay out the feats of his rival. And that difference, once you notice it, is itself a kind of answer, or at least a kind of shape to the question. Voldemort's power comes to us as a series of stark and specific achievements, each one recorded, each one dreadful and clear. Grindelwald's power comes to us as an atmosphere, a reputation, a weight that history assigns him without always showing its work. It would be easy and unfair to take that difference and simply declare that the wizard we can measure is the stronger. But that is not how a fair weighing goes. A thing is not weak merely because the story chose to look away before it happened. The mountain does not shrink because you arrived after the eruption and saw only the changed and smoking land. You can read the power in what it left behind. And what Grindelwald left behind was immense. He rose across a whole continent. He built a following that spanned nations. He acquired the Elder Wand, the deadliest wand ever made, and wielded it with such mastery that he became, for a long stretch of years, very nearly unbeatable in single combat, which is a claim the books make plainly and without hedging. That is not the record of a middling talent riding on charm alone. Charm opened the doors, yes, and vision drew the crowds, but no wizard holds a continent in dread through charm without the raw force to make the dread real. There were surely those who tested him and found, to their sorrow, that the legend and the man were made of the same terrible stuff. So when we lay his raw magic beside Voldemort's, we must be careful in two directions at once. We must not inflate him past the evidence, filling every gap in the record with glory, simply because the gaps are dark and inviting, and we must not shrink him past the evidence either, mistaking the silence of the books for the absence of power. The truest thing we can say tonight, and it is a restful thing, is that Grindelwald was a magical genius of the very highest order, a wizard whose gifts placed him briefly beside the greatest of all, and whose reign proves a power vast enough to overshadow a continent. Even if the pages we were given chose to show us the after and not the during. There is something almost peaceful, is there not, in a power that must be inferred rather than displayed. Voldemort's magic hits you like a blow you can point to and name. Grindelwald's magic settles over you like the memory of a storm you were told about as a child, half fact and half awe, and no less real for being remembered rather than seen. Both are terrible. Both are true. And as you lie there in the soft dark, you might let the two of them sit side by side in your mind, the counted and the recalled, the ledger and the legend, neither one yet declared the greater. Both of them enormous and strange and far away. We are not ready quite to say which of them edges ahead on the raw and wordless craft of sorcery itself. That gentle reckoning waits for us just a little further on, and there is no need to hurry toward it. For now it is enough to have held Grindelwald's power fairly in the hand, to have felt how much of it lives in what he built and what he broke, rather than in what the story let us watch, and to know that a thing may be mighty even when it comes to us wrapped in the quiet of legend and the long, forgiving distance of time. Now we come to the gentlest kind of reckoning, the one where we set the two of them side by side in the matter of raw magic alone, the pure and wordless craft of sorcery, and try to feel which one edges ahead. And I want you to know, before we even begin, that there is no shouting in this reckoning, no triumphant trumpet, no verdict slammed down like a gavel. We are only turning the two smooth stones over once more, feeling their weight against the palm, and letting the heavier one settle a little lower. It is a slow thing and a kind thing, and it asks nothing of you but to lie still and follow the soft thread of the thought. Let us be fair first to what they share, because they share a great deal. Both were prodigies of the rarest sort, wizards whose gifts announced themselves young and never dimmed. Both reached into the deepest and most forbidden waters of magic and did not drown. Both frightened the wizards who were supposed to be beyond fright. If the question were simply which of them was a genius, there would be no question at all, for they were both geniuses, and the world has known very few of their kind in all its long and shadowed history. So when we ask which edges ahead, we are not separating the strong from the weak. We are separating the extraordinary from the extraordinary, splitting a hair that most wizards could not even see, and we do it softly. And when we look closely, a quiet pattern shows itself. Voldemort's raw power reaches us as a set of stark and documented feats, each one extreme, each one recorded in the pages we were given. He could fly without a broom, unsupported, drifting through the air like smoke, and this was a feat so rare that even those who feared him gasped to see it, for no wizard was known to do it before him. He mastered the killing curse until it fell from his wand as easily as breath. He tore his own soul apart, not once but again and again, working the darkest magic that magic has ever named, and he survived the tearing, which no one else had dared or managed. His mind could pierce other minds, reading them, bending them, planting terror and false visions where he wished. These are not vague glories. They are specific, terrible things, laid out plainly, and you can count them on your fingers in the dark. Grindelwald's raw power, as we weighed it a little while ago, reaches us differently, wrapped in legend and distance, proven by the vastness of what he built and broke, rather than shown to us feat by feat upon the page. And so the honest weighing, the fair one, tilts in a particular way, and I will say it softly. On the matter of documented, extreme, catalogued sorcery, the kind you can point to and name, Voldemort edges ahead. Not because Grindelwald was lesser in the deep well of his talent, but because Voldemort took his talent to places that were written down and marveled at, places darker and stranger than perhaps any wizard had gone before. He did not merely have great power. He spent it recklessly on feats that widened the very map of what magic was thought to allow. There is a particular weight to the Horcruxes in this reckoning, and it is worth resting on for a moment. To split the soul is not only wicked, it is difficult beyond almost all other magic, a working so unnatural that most dark wizards who learned of it recoiled and never attempted it even once. Voldemort did it 7 times over, or near enough, remaking himself into something that death itself could not simply claim. Whatever else you say of him, this is a feat of raw magical achievement that stands almost alone in all the history we are given, and Grindelwald, for all his gifts, never reached for it. He did not want it, we are told, for his hungers ran a different way. But the reckoning of raw power does not ask what a wizard wanted. It asks what a wizard could do and did. And here Voldemort walked a road that Grindelwald never walked at all. Think too of the small and early signs, the ones that came before the great and terrible feats, for raw power shows itself young in both of these wizards, and in Voldemort it showed itself with a chill that the story lets us feel directly. As a child in the orphanage, before ever he had held a wand or spoken a single incantation, the boy who would become Voldemort could already make things happen by will alone. He could move objects without touching them, could speak to serpents in their own hissing tongue, could reach into other children and hurt them with nothing but the force of his wanting. This is magic without training, magic without a wand, the raw current of it running so strong through one small child that it frightened those around him long before anyone taught him a thing. Few wizards in all the tale show that kind of untutored power so early or so darkly, and it tells us that the well he drew from was deep from the very beginning, deeper perhaps than any his rivals were born with. And Grindelwald too was a prodigy from his earliest years, brilliant beyond his fellows, so that we must not imagine the young Voldemort standing alone in his precocity. But here again we meet the same quiet pattern that has followed us through all our weighing of these two. Of Voldemort's childhood power, we are given scenes, moments, specific and unsettling proofs set down upon the page. Of Grindelwald's early brilliance, we are given reputation and rumor, the knowledge that he shone at Durmstrang and reached too far too fast, but not the same close and countable glimpses. So even in the nursery of their power, one comes to us measured and the other comes to us remembered, and the scale tips the same gentle way it has tipped throughout, toward the wizard whose feats were written down. Yet, even as the stone settles lower on Voldemort's side, we must hold the balance with an open and honest hand, because the matter is not clean, and a fair weighing admits its own uncertainty. Remember that we never saw Grindelwald in his prime upon the page. Remember that he stood as an equal beside Dumbledore, the greatest wizard of the age, in the summer of their youth, and that Dumbledore himself feared to face him for years afterward, delaying their reckoning out of dread and grief and something like awe. A wizard who could make Albus Dumbledore hesitate is a wizard whose raw power we should never underestimate. It is entirely possible, and no fair storyteller would deny it, that Grindelwald in his full flower was every bit Voldemort's equal in pure sorcery, and that only the silence of the record, the accident of which years the story chose to show us, makes him seem the lesser. So let the verdict be gentle, and let it be twofold, the way the truest verdicts often are. On the evidence we are given, on the plain and countable feats set down in the books, Voldemort edges ahead in raw magic, for his achievements are more extreme, more numerous, and more clearly recorded, and the Horcruxes alone mark a summit that his rival never climbed. But on the deeper and unprovable question of who held the greater well of talent within him, the honest answer is that we cannot truly say, and that Grindelwald may well have matched him, gift for gift, in a prime we were never permitted to witness. The one we can measure stands a little taller. The one we can only imagine may stand just as tall, hidden in the mist. And there is something restful in leaving it exactly there, half decided and half open, the way the best questions are. If the reckoning came down like a hammer, one name crushed and the other crowned, the mind would have nowhere left to wander. But because it comes down softly, because it says, here is what we can prove, and here is what we must leave to wonder. The thought stays gentle and unhurried, and you can turn it over as long as you like, without ever needing to finish it. Voldemort, the wizard of counted horrors, the flyer and the soul splitter, the master of the killing light. Grindelwald, the wizard of remembered storms, the equal of Dumbledore, the genius, the record left in shadow. Two summits, one a little clearer than the other, both wrapped in the same high cold air. Let that be enough for tonight on the matter of raw magic. We have held both stones. We have felt one settle a little lower, and we have been honest about why. And honest, too, about all the reasons the balance might have tipped the other way in a fairer light. That is the whole of a good weighing, to lean where the evidence leans, and to confess where the evidence runs out. There is more to compare between these two, other kinds of power that have nothing to do with the wordless craft of sorcery, and we will come to those in their own good time, slowly, with no hurry at all. But the raw magic rests now, weighed as fairly as two such terrible wizards can be weighed, and you may let it rest with it, easy and unfinished. In the quiet of the dark, we move now from the raw well of magic to the art of the duel, which is a different thing altogether, and in some ways a purer test of a wizard's power. For a duel does not care how much you know or how deep your talent runs, unless you can bring it forth in the space of a heartbeat, against a mind that is trying just as hard to end you. Knowledge sits quietly. Dueling moves. And in the whole long history of wizarding combat, there is one name that rises above almost every other when the great duelists are counted, and that name is Gellert Grindelwald. The books do not merely suggest that he was skilled. They tell us, plainly and without hedging, that he was one of the most dangerous and accomplished duelists ever to lift a wand, and that for a long stretch of years he was thought to be simply unbeatable in single combat. Sit with that word a moment, gently. Unbeatable. Not merely very good, not merely feared, but a wizard whom no one could reliably expect to defeat, so that to face him wand to wand was widely understood to be a form of suicide dressed up as courage. Wizards of great power looked at the prospect of dueling Grindelwald and quietly decided that there were other ways to spend their lives. Part of this, of course, was the wand he carried. For Grindelwald had won the Elder Wand, the deadliest wand ever made, the first of the 3 deathly hollows, a wand whose whole dark legend is that it makes its true master invincible in a duel. He had taken it, we are told, from the wandmaker Grigorovich, slipping in and seizing it, and from that day it answered to him with its full and terrible loyalty. And here is the thing you must feel to understand his dueling greatness properly. The Elder Wand does not make a poor wizard great. It amplifies what is already there. It rewards mastery. A clumsy hand would not have become unbeatable simply by holding it. It was the meeting of a supremely gifted duelist and the most powerful wand in the world that made Grindelwald what he was in combat. And that meeting was a fearful thing, a genius and a legend fused into a single wielded flame. But do not think for a moment that the wand was the whole of it, for the books are careful to praise the man himself. His skill was spoken of as its own marvel, apart from any wand, a swiftness and a cunning and a ferocity in combat that would have made him formidable holding any wand at all. The Elder Wand made him unbeatable. Yes, but he was already among the greatest before he ever laid his hand upon it. That is the honest shape of his dueling power, a rare and dreadful talent, raised by the deadliest wand ever made to a height that the wizarding world could scarcely believe or challenge. And so we come to the duel, the one that history remembers above all others, the duel of 1945, when Albus Dumbledore at last went to face his old friend and stop him. It is called, again and again, the greatest duel in wizarding history, and the phrase is not idle flattery. It is a judgment passed down through the generations, the considered opinion of a world that had seen many duels and set this one above them all. Think of what that means. Of every clash of every wizard across all the centuries, this is the one that stands at the summit. And it earned that place because of what both wizards brought to it. On the one side stood Dumbledore, whom many held to be the greatest wizard alive, the only man Voldemort himself would ever truly fear. On the other stood Grindelwald, the unbeatable duelist, holding the unbeatable wand. It should have been no contest at all. By every ordinary reckoning, a wizard armed with the Elder Wand and famed as the finest duelist of the age should have swept aside even Dumbledore. That is what made the duel so extraordinary and so terrible to those who witnessed or later heard of it. It was the meeting of the greatest wizard and the greatest duelist, and it was fought at a pitch of skill and power that no one who saw it ever forgot. We are not shown the blow-by-blow of it in the books, and the storyteller will not invent one, for that would be to paint over canon with guesswork. What we are given is the weight of it, the enormity, the fact that it was long and fierce and beautiful and dreadful, and that when it ended, Grindelwald had at last been beaten, and the Elder Wand had passed to Dumbledore. Some have quietly wondered whether Grindelwald's old love for his friend stayed his hand at the last, whether some corner of him did not truly wish to strike Dumbledore down, and the books leave room for that gentle possibility without ever settling it. We may hold it as one of the soft mysteries of the tale. But whatever the truth of his heart in that hour, the fact of the duel stands. It was the greatest ever fought, and Grindelwald was one of its two titans. There is a further wonder hidden in that duel, one that deepens Grindelwald's greatness rather than diminishing it, and it is worth turning over slowly in the quiet. For Dumbledore, when at last he faced his old friend, was not merely a great wizard meeting a lesser foe. He was a wizard who had every reason to dread the encounter, and who had put it off for years, and part of that dread was surely the plain and dreadful skill of the man he must fight. To beat the holder of the Elder Wand, to overcome a duelist the whole world believed unbeatable, was so near to impossible that even Dumbledore approached it as the labor of a lifetime. That the victory came at all is a mark of Dumbledore's supremacy. But that the victory came so hard, so slowly, at such cost and such height, is a mark of Grindelwald, of just how far a wizard had to climb to overcome him. The greatest duel in history was great in both directions, and its loser was as much its author as its winner. We might pause, too, on the strange and quiet fact that these two, who fought the finest duel ever known, had once been the dearest of friends, boys together in the summer light of Godric's Hollow, dreaming their vast and terrible dreams side by side. The greatest duel in wizarding history was fought between two men who had loved each other, and who knew each other's minds as few duelists ever could. Perhaps that is part of why it was so great, for each understood the other's every strength and turn, and each had to overcome not only a stranger's skill, but a friend's, remembered from a summer long ago. There is a sorrow folded into that combat, a grief beneath the fire, and it belongs to the weighing too, for it reminds us that Grindelwald's greatness was never only cold. It was tangled with a whole life, a whole ruined friendship, a whole abandoned dream, and even in losing it, he lost in a way that lifts him rather than lowers him. For to be defeated only by Dumbledore, only by the single wizard the world agreed was supreme, only after a struggle so vast it became the measuring stick for all duels ever after, is not really to be diminished. It is to be placed at the very top of the mountain and shown to be the second highest peak upon it, and the two peaks so close together that from a distance you can hardly tell which is which. There is no shame in that summit. There is only greatness, the terrible cold greatness of a duelist who frightened a continent and was overcome only by the finest wizard who ever lived. After the duel, they took him to Nurmengard, the high dark prison fortress he himself had raised to hold his own enemies, and they shut him in its topmost cell, and the greatest duelist of his age lived out his years there, wandless, behind stone he had chosen and shaped. There is a strange and sombre poetry in that, is there not? That the unbeatable duelist should end his days disarmed in the very tower he built for the defeated. The wand that had made him invincible now answered to another, far away, and Grindelwald in his cell became at last only a man, an old and fading legend, his dueling days long behind him. But when we weigh his power tonight, we weigh him at his height, not in his fall. And at his height he was, quite simply, one of the greatest duelists the wizarding world has ever known or ever will. The unbeatable wand in the unbeatable hand. The subject of the finest duel ever fought. A wizard whose combat was spoken of with the same hush reserved for storms and for legends. Hold that image gently as you drift, the two great figures facing each other in 1945, wands raised, the air between them alive with a power the world would never see equaled. And carry the questions softly forward, for we have weighed one duelist now, and his rival waits. When Voldemort steps into this same slow scale, we shall see how the terror of the later age measures against the unbeatable master of the earlier one, and whether the second peak of that mountain finds, at last, a rival worthy to stand beside it. And now the other duelist steps quietly into the scale, and we weigh Lord Voldemort as a warrior of the wand, which is a fitting thing to do. For while Grindelwald's greatness in combat comes to us softened by legend and distance, Voldemort's we saw with our own eyes, again and again, across the pages of the story we followed. If ever there was a dark wizard whose dueling was shown rather than merely told, it was he. And so we can hold his combat in the hand with a clearness we could not quite manage for his rival. Begin where the books begin their testament to him, in the great hall of the Ministry of Magic, on the night when at last the two greatest wizards of the age faced each other, Voldemort and Dumbledore, wand to wand, in the very heart of wizarding Britain. It is one of the most astonishing scenes in all the tale, and it earns its place, for here we see Voldemort not against some frightened lesser wizard, but against the one man the world held to be supreme, the very man who had beaten Grindelwald himself. And Voldemort did not fall. He was not swept aside. He fought Dumbledore at a height that shook the whole chamber, hurling curses that tore the air, conjuring fire and serpents and shattering enchantments, matching the greatest wizard alive blow for blow in a struggle so tremendous that those who witnessed it could scarcely believe what they were seeing. Sit with the weight of that, gently, for it is the heart of Voldemort's claim as a duelist. He stood against Dumbledore, and was not simply overpowered. The duel did not end with Voldemort broken upon the floor. It ended, instead, with his slipping away, unwilling to be caught but unbroken. And this is a very different thing from the 1945 duel, where Grindelwald was defeated outright and stripped of his wand. Voldemort, in his great clash with Dumbledore, held his ground against the finest wizard in the world and lived to vanish into the dark. That alone places him among the mightiest duelists the wizarding world has known, for the number of wizards who could face Dumbledore and not fall can be counted very nearly upon a single hand. And it was not only the raw force of his curses that made him deadly in a duel, though that force was immense. It was the whole cold machinery of him, the swiftness of his mind, the utter lack of hesitation, the readiness to reach for the most lethal magic without a flicker of restraint. Where another wizard might pause, might flinch, might hold back some final cruelty, Voldemort never did. He fought the way a serpent strikes, with a speed and a certainty that gave his opponents no room to breathe. He wielded the killing curse like a common spell, casting the green light again and again. And to duel him was to know that every exchange carried death in it, that there was no gentle losing, no honorable draw, only survival or the end. It is worth pausing on the sheer variety of the magic he could bring to bear in a duel. For a great duelist is not merely one who casts a single deadly curse quickly. He is one who commands a whole armory and can reach for the right weapon in an instant. Voldemort could conjure fire that moved with a will of its own, could summon and command serpents in the midst of combat, could shield and shatter and vanish and reappear, could bend the very stone and air of a room to his purpose. His flight without a broom, that rare and eerie gift, served him in combat too, letting him move through the air as smoke moves, hard to fix and harder to strike. To duel him was not to face a single trick, but to face a storm of many, each one lethal, each one delivered without mercy or pause. This breadth is its own kind of dueling greatness, and it stood at the very front rank of what any wizard has ever managed to wield in the heat of a fight. We saw him too against Harry, more than once across the years, and though Harry was a boy and no match for him in pure skill, those meetings still tell us something of Voldemort's combat. In the graveyard, when he returned to his body, he toyed with Harry, sure of his mastery, and it was only the strange and unlooked-for magic of their twin wand cores, the rare and beautiful accident of priori incantatem, that let the boy escape at all. Voldemort's power was not in doubt in that graveyard. He was in complete command of the duel, and only a thing neither of them understood, a deep secret of the wands themselves, snatched Harry from his grasp. Again and again it is this pattern with Voldemort, that his own dueling might is overwhelming, and that what undoes it is never a stronger opponent, but some hidden law of magic he failed to grasp. And so, we come to the last duel of all, in the Great Hall of Hogwarts, in 1998, when Voldemort faced Harry for the final time before the whole watching remnant of the battle. Here Voldemort held the Elder Wand itself, the same deadly wand Grindelwald had once wielded to become unbeatable, and here at last we might have seen him at the very summit of dueling power, the greatest wand in the world in the hand of a wizard who had fought Dumbledore to a standstill. And yet, this is where the two duelists part ways most sharply, and where the weighing grows most tender and most instructive. For Grindelwald had truly mastered the Elder Wand. It answered to him with its full loyalty, and in his hand it made him what the legend says, invincible. Voldemort held the same wand and was not its master at all. Its allegiance had never been his, for the deep and secret law of the wand runs by conquest and by ownership, not by theft and murder, and its true loyalty had passed quietly to Harry through a chain of disarmings that Voldemort never understood. And so at Hogwarts, when Voldemort cast his killing curse, and Harry cast his disarming charm, the Elder Wand would not turn its full power against its own true master. Voldemort's own curse rebounded upon him, and he fell, undone not by a greater duelist, but by his blindness to the very wand he wielded. This is the crucial difference, and it is worth holding softly side by side. As a duelist of pure skill and power, Voldemort was magnificent, perhaps the equal in raw combat of anyone who ever lived, a wizard who stood against Dumbledore and did not break. But he never mastered the Elder Wand, as Grindelwald mastered it, and in the one duel where he held it, it betrayed him, because he had never truly won it. Grindelwald's dueling greatness reached its height with the wand fully his and fully obedient. Voldemort's dueling greatness reached its end with the wand in his hand, but its heart turned against him. The same wand, and two utterly different stories of mastery. So, how do we weigh the two duelists? Gently, as the two smooth stones settle once more against the palm. On pure recorded skill against the greatest opponents, both are titans. And here Voldemort has the clearer testament. For we watched him stand against Dumbledore and survive, where Grindelwald was defeated. Yet on the matter of the wand that both of them touched, Grindelwald edges ahead, for he made the Elder Wand truly his and became unbeatable, while Voldemort held it and was mastered by his own misunderstanding. Perhaps the fairest sleepy thought is this. Voldemort may have been the more purely dangerous duelist in raw skill and ferocity, striking like the serpent, sparing nothing. But Grindelwald, with the Elder Wand fully his, reached a height of dueling invincibility that Voldemort, for all his terror, never truly held, because the wand he stole would not love him. Let that rest, unhurried and unfinished, as the night deepens. Two duelists, each a summit, each terrible in his own way. One who stood against the greatest wizard and lived. One who mastered the greatest wand and could not be beaten until the greatest wizard beat him. Turn them over slowly in the dark, the serpent and the storm, and let the weighing carry you softly onward. For there is more of these two dark wizards to hold and to compare, and there is all the quiet time in the world to hold it. There is a quiet truth about dark wizards that we do not often pause to consider, and tonight, in the soft hush of this late hour, we can turn it over gently in the mind. A dark wizard, however gifted, is only one person, one wand, one will, one pair of hands. What makes such a figure truly dangerous is not merely his own power, but the number of others who choose to follow him, and the reasons they choose to do so. And here, in the matter of followers and influence, our two dark wizards diverge as sharply as two rivers running down opposite sides of the same mountain. For Gellert Grindelwald gathered people to him through a dream, and Lord Voldemort gathered them through dread, and the difference between those two kinds of gathering tells us a great deal about the men themselves. Let us begin with Grindelwald, for he was the elder and the wider of the two in his reach. He did not build his power in a single country. He built it across a continent. In the early decades of the 20th century, while much of the Muggle world was shaken by its own great wars, Grindelwald moved through the wizarding nations of Europe like a slow and rising tide, and everywhere he went he spoke of a new order. He offered a vision. He told wizards and witches that they need not hide any longer, that they need not cower in secret, that they were not lesser beings but greater ones, and that a better world was waiting to be built if only they had the courage to reach for it. And that vision, wrapped in the soft and terrible banner of the words "for the greater good," drew crowds to him. It drew the young and the restless, the proud and the wounded, the clever and the ambitious. People came to Grindelwald not because they feared what he would do to them if they refused, but because they wanted, with all their hearts, what he was promising them. That is a rare and dangerous kind of power, and it is worth resting on for a moment. Grindelwald was magnetic. He had charm that could fill a room, and then fill a hall, and then, in time, fill the imaginations of thousands. He could stand before a gathering and speak in a way that made each listener feel that the future itself was leaning toward them, that they were being invited into something vast and shining and right. He did not need to threaten. He seduced. His followers believed in the cause or believed in him, and often could not have told you where one belief ended and the other began. And because they believed, they gave him something that fear can never quite purchase, which is willing devotion. A frightened servant obeys only while the master is watching. A true believer carries the flame onward, even in the dark. Grindelwald gave that movement a shape and a stronghold. He raised the fortress of Nurmengard, a grim tower meant to hold his enemies, and its very name became a shadow across Europe. His influence stretched from nation to nation, and there were those in high places who quietly wondered whether he might not, in the end, simply win. His was the power of a movement, of an idea that had slipped its cage and begun to spread on its own, mouth to mouth, heart to heart. And an idea, once loosed, is far harder to kill than any single man. Now let us set beside him the other, and feel how different the weight is in the hand. Lord Voldemort also gathered followers, and his were called the Death Eaters, and they were fearsome in their own right. But the shape of his following was not broad and continental. It was narrow and deep and coiled tightly around the island of Britain. Voldemort did not offer a shining future to the many. He offered power and survival to the few who served him, and terror to everyone else. His inner circle was small, drawn largely from the old pure blood families, wizards who prized their bloodlines and were flattered to be told that they were the rightful masters of the magical world. To them he gave status, and cruelty made respectable, and the dark thrill of belonging to something feared. And in return, he demanded absolute obedience. Yet notice the nature of that obedience. It was not, for the most part, love. It was not the willing devotion that gathered around Grindelwald. It was loyalty braided together out of fear and greed and fanaticism. And those are strong cords, but they are not the same cord. Many of Voldemort's followers served him because they were terrified of what he would do to them and to their families if they wavered. He ruled his own people much as he ruled everyone else, by making the price of disappointing him unbearable. He marked them, body and soul, with the dark mark burned into their arms, a brand that could summon them to his side in an instant, and that bound them to him whether they wished it or not. His was not a fellowship, it was a leash. And so we may weigh the two. Grindelwald's reach was arguably the broader. He swayed nations. He built something that looked, for a time, like a genuine movement, an idea with momentum of its own, capable of surviving even the fall of its founder. His influence was wide, and it was deep in a different way, planted in the beliefs of thousands who wanted what he promised. There is a reason that his rise is remembered as one of the darkest chapters in the whole history of magical Europe, a shadow that fell not over one country, but over many. Voldemort's grip, by contrast, was narrower but more absolute. Within the world he chose to conquer, which was chiefly wizarding Britain, his hold was total in a way that Grindelwald's never quite was. He did not merely influence that society. He took hold of its throat. In the final years, he seized the ministry itself and turned the machinery of government into an instrument of his will, and no one in that country was safe. Not the powerful, not the ordinary, not even the children in their school. Where Grindelwald inspired, Voldemort suffocated. His was the more perfect tyranny over the smaller kingdom, and in that difference we can almost see the two men whole. Grindelwald wanted followers because he wanted to change the world, and a world is changed by many hands and many hearts. He needed believers. He needed a movement, because his goal lived out in the wide world beyond himself. Voldemort wanted followers chiefly because they were useful to him, tools and shields and servants in his own great project, which was, above all, himself, his own rule, his own deathless survival. Grindelwald pointed his people toward a horizon. Voldemort pointed his people at his enemies. One built a cause that might outlast him. The other built a court that could not. Ask yourself, in the gentle dark, which of these is the greater power? The wide reach that stirs the beliefs of nations, or the narrow grip that owns a country utterly? There is no simple answer, and we are not here tonight to force one. Perhaps the truest thing to say is that Grindelwald's influence was more like weather, vast and spreading and hard to hold, while Voldemort's was more like winter come down upon a single valley, complete and merciless and cold. Both filled the sky with darkness. They only did it in different measures. We will let that thought settle now, the way a crowd settles into silence after the speaker has gone and the torches have burned low. Two movements, two kinds of loyalty, two very different ways of binding others to a dark and hungry will. One woven of belief, one woven of fear. Rest a moment on the strange lesson hidden there, that the men who most wished to stand alone above all others could not, in the end, rise at all without the willing or unwilling shoulders of the many. And with that quiet thought held loosely, like a warm stone cooling in the palm, let your breathing slow, and let the tide of it all draw gently back out to sea. Fear is a quiet thing, for all its power. It does not always shout. Often it works in whispers, in the lowering of a voice, in the small hesitation before a name is spoken aloud. And tonight we come to weigh the fear that these two dark wizards cast into the world, for of all the ways we might measure their power, this may be the most human and the most telling. Not what they could do, but what people felt when they thought of them. Let us settle in and consider gently the shape of the dread that each of them left behind. Begin with Lord Voldemort, because his fear took a form so strange and so complete that it became a kind of legend all on its own. Across wizarding Britain, in the years of his rising and again in his return, people grew so afraid of him that they would not say his name. They called him other things instead. They called him you-know-who, as though naming him plainly might draw his attention across the miles. They called him he who must not be named, a title that is itself a small monument to terror, a phrase built entirely out of the refusal to speak. And many, even among the brave, would flinch at the sound of the true name when someone dared to use it, as though a cold draught had blown through the room. Sit with how remarkable that is. A whole society had taught itself not to speak two syllables. Fear had reached so deep into the ordinary life of a people that it had reshaped their very language, had carved a hole in it, in the exact shape of one man. That is not the fear of a single frightening person in a single frightening moment. That is fear made into a habit, fear passed from parent to child, fear worn smooth by repetition until it felt simply like the way the world was. There were households where the name was forbidden, schools where teachers grew pale at it. Grown witches and wizards who had faced down all manner of dangers and yet could not bring themselves to let those sounds cross their lips. And notice, too, how the silence fed upon itself. For each person who declined to speak the name taught the next that it was a name too dreadful to speak, and so the fear was handed down and thickened with every passing, until it seemed as old and natural as the fear of the dark itself. A thing no one questioned because everyone shared it. And there was a reason the fear ran so deep, for it was fed by a very real and very personal cruelty. Voldemort did not merely threaten in the abstract. He came into homes. He killed parents in front of children, and children in front of parents. He tortured for pleasure and for information, and sometimes, it seemed, simply to remind the world what he was. His terror was intimate. It could arrive at any door. and because no one knew where he would strike next, everyone felt the shadow of him everywhere, which is the particular genius of that kind of dread. He did not need to be in 1,000 places. He only needed people to believe that he might be. His name became unspeakable because the thing behind it felt, to those who lived under it, like death itself, patient and personal and always near. Now let us turn, softly, to Gellert Grindelwald, and here the texture of the fear is different and stranger and worth handling with care. Grindelwald, too, was feared. He spread terror across Europe, and his name carried weight enough to make wizards and witches uneasy in 6 nations. Nurmengard, the fortress he raised, became a word that meant dread. Those who opposed him had good reason to be afraid, for he could be ruthless, and the power gathered behind him was vast. In the raw sense, then, he inspired fear on a scale as wide as any wizard of his age. But here is the difference, and it is a delicate one. Grindelwald was feared, and he was also admired. He was not only a shadow, he was, to a great many people, a light, however false a light it proved to be. There were those who trembled at his coming, and those who longed for it. And often these were not different people, but the very same ones, drawn and frightened at once, the way one is drawn to and frightened by a great storm. His fear was mixed with hope, with dazzlement, with the intoxicating sense that he might be right. People did not refuse to speak his name. They spoke it eagerly, some of them, as the name of the man who would remake the world. His terror wore a beautiful face, and that made it in some ways more insidious, because a man who is only feared can at least be plainly opposed, while a man who is feared and adored splits the heart of everyone who beholds him. So when we set the two side by side, on this one measure of fear, a clear thing emerges, and it is one of the few places in our long weighing where the scales tip with real firmness. On sheer dread, on pure and undiluted terror, Voldemort stands above. No wizard in memory made himself so unspeakable, so wholly a thing of nightmare, that an entire people would rather bend their language than let his name be heard. Grindelwald frightened nations, yes, but he also charmed them, and a fear that is braided with admiration is a lesser fear than one that is pure. Voldemort offered nothing to soften the terror. He was not beautiful. He was not beloved. He did not wish to be. He wanted to be feared, only feared, absolutely feared, and in that dark ambition he succeeded as perhaps no wizard before him ever had. There is something worth noticing here about the two men, hidden inside the difference in their fear. Grindelwald wanted to be followed, and so he needed to be, at least in part, loved. And love and fear cannot help but dilute one another. Voldemort did not care to be loved. He had never, from his loveless childhood onward, understood love as anything but a weakness in others to be exploited. And so he never sought it, not even from his own. He wanted power, and he had decided long ago that fear was the surest road to it, that it was better, as he saw the world, to be dreaded than to be adored. Because adoration can cool, but dread endures. And so he made himself into a pure engine of fear, and stripped away everything that might have made him merely a man to be admired, until nothing was left but the terror. And yet, in the gentle way of these things, there is a shadow of weakness even in Voldemort's mighty fear, and it is worth resting on before we let the thought go. Because his terror was so total, it made those who overcame it all the more powerful against him. The simple act of speaking his name became, for a few brave souls, a small rebellion. A way of saying that he was, after all, only a wizard, only a man, only a Tom Riddle grown monstrous. Fear that great creates, here and there, a fearlessness to answer it, and that answering courage would in the end be part of his undoing. A tyranny built wholly on dread has this hidden flaw, that the moment the dread cracks, even a little, the whole edifice begins to tremble. But that is a matter for later chapters and later nights. For now, let us simply hold the two fears in our two hands and feel their weight. One of them mixed, bright and terrible. The fear of a man who was also a dream. The other pure, cold, and absolute. The fear of a name too dreadful to be spoken. On this measure, the darker crown goes to Voldemort, the one who wished only to be feared, and who was feared as no one else. Let that settle over you now like the deepest part of the night, and know that here, safe and warm and wakeful only a little longer, there is nothing at all to be afraid of. Let the old dread of stories stay in the story, and let your own breath grow slow and easy and unhurried. Of all the threads that run through the long tale of these two dark wizards, there is one that binds them together more tightly than any other. A single slender thing of dark wood that passed, across the years, from one pair of hands toward the other. It is the Elder Wand, and tonight and tomorrow night we will follow it slowly, for it is the very heart of our weighing. Two men reached for the most powerful wand ever made. One of them mastered it. One of them did not. And in that difference lies perhaps the deepest answer to our gentle question of who was truly the greater. Tonight, we begin with the one who won it and wielded it well. Let us first remember, softly, what the Elder Wand is, so that we may feel the weight of what it meant to hold it. Among the three legendary Deathly Hallows, it is the wand of unbeatable power, said to have been made by Death himself in the oldest of the old stories. A wand that wins every duel for its true master, that cannot be defeated in fair combat while its allegiance holds. Down the long centuries it passed from hand to hand, and its trail is written in blood, for it has a cruel habit. It does not stay loyal out of love or law. It goes to the one who conquers, to the wizard who overcomes its previous keeper, whether by killing or disarming, or simply by mastering him. It is a wand that respects only strength, and it changes hands whenever a greater strength appears. And so it is drifted down the ages like a bright and dangerous coin, luring the ambitious, undoing them, and moving on. By the early years of the 20th century, the wand had come into the keeping of a wandmaker named Grigorovich, a craftsman of great renown, who understood, it seems, something of what he held. There are stories that he tried to unlock its secrets, that he wished to learn how such a wand was made so that he might make its equal. But knowing what a thing is and being fit to keep it are not the same, and into Grigorovich's world there came a young man with pale gold hair and eyes that seemed to see further than other men's, and that young man was Gellert Grindelwald. Grindelwald took the wand. He stole it, slipping into Grigorovich's keeping and out again, and in the taking he won its allegiance, for he had overcome its keeper and claimed it for his own. And here we must pause and notice something, because it matters greatly for our weighing. The wand went to Grindelwald willingly, in the way that wand goes to anyone. He conquered its previous master, and so its loyalty turned to him, cleanly and completely. From that moment, the most powerful wand ever made was truly his, not borrowed, not stolen in name only, but his by the wand's own dark rules. He had done the thing correctly, whether he understood every detail of the wand's lore or not. He had won it, and the winning made it obey. And obey it did. With the Elder Wand in his hand, Grindelwald became something close to unbeatable. Remember that he was already one of the most gifted duelists ever to live. Brilliant and swift and inventive. A wizard whose skill alone would have set him among the great. Now place into that already formidable hand the very wand that wins every duel, and you begin to feel the scale of what he had become. For years he rose and rose, and there seemed to be no one in all of Europe who could stand against him. He spread his movement, he built his fortress, he gathered his followers, and behind all of it lay the quiet, terrible confidence of a man who held the one weapon that could not be beaten. His power and the wand's power had become one thing. They fit together. The greatest duelist and the greatest wand matched at last, and for a long and dreadful season it seemed the world had no answer for them. This is the crucial thing to hold tonight, the thing we will set against tomorrow's tale like a stone upon a scale. Grindelwald and the Elder Wand belonged together. He had earned it by the wand's own law, and he had the skill to use every ounce of what it offered, and so there was no gap between the master and the tool. When he raised that wand, all of its power flowed through him unhindered, because it was truly his, and he was truly its match. That is a rare and fearsome harmony, and it is the reason his defeat, when it finally came, is remembered as the greatest duel in all the history of magic. It took the one wizard in the world, who was his equal, and more, to overcome a Grindelwald armed with the unbeatable wand. Anything less would have shattered against him. We will not tell the whole of that defeat tonight, for it belongs to another part of our long weighing, but we may let its shape hang softly in the dark. In the year 1945, at the height of his terror, Grindelwald was met at last by Albus Dumbledore, the friend of his youth become his greatest foe, and in a duel that the wizarding world still speaks of in hushed and wondering tones. The unbeatable wand was, against every expectation, beaten, and because the wand goes always to the one who conquers, in that moment its allegiance turned again, and passed from Grindelwald to Dumbledore, quietly, in the way it always passes, on the current of a single victory. Grindelwald was taken and locked away in Nurmengard, the very fortress he had built for his enemies, and the wand went home in Dumbledore's keeping, to serve, for once, a gentler master. But set the ending aside for now, and stay with the wand itself, and with what its long stay in Grindelwald's hand tells us. For this is the point that will glow all the brighter when we set the other man beside it tomorrow. Grindelwald did the thing that the Elder Wand demands. He met its price. He won it fairly by its own cruel measure. He had the skill to wield it fully, and so for as long as he held it, it gave him everything it had to give. The wand and the wizard were not at odds. There was no secret flaw hidden between them, no misunderstanding waiting to bring him down. When Grindelwald fell, he did not fall because the wand betrayed him, or because he had failed to understand it. He fell only because a greater wizard, on a single extraordinary day, proved stronger. That is a clean defeat, an honest one, the defeat of a true master overcome by a truer one. Hold that clarity in your mind as the night deepens, for it is a lovely and simple shape, and tomorrow we will watch it break. A man reaches for the most powerful wand in the world. He wins it by the rules that govern it. He wields it as few could ever wield it. And when at last it leaves him, it leaves cleanly, drawn away by a stronger hand in fair and open combat. There is a terrible elegance to it, the elegance of a thing done rightly even in the service of a wrong cause. Grindelwald understood, in his bones, what it meant to master such a wand, and for a long dark season the wand answered him without reserve. Let that thought rest with you now, smooth and complete, like a wand laid down at last upon a still table. The winning, the wielding, the clean and honest losing. Tomorrow we will follow the same slim length of wood into other, colder hands, and watch a very different wizard grasp at the same power and never truly close his fingers around it. But that is for the next quiet hour. For now, let the image soften. Let the great duel fade into a far and gentle glimmer. and let your thoughts grow as still and as slow as the wand upon the table, waiting patiently in the dark. Last night we followed the elder wand into the hands of a man who won it and mastered it, and we left it resting there in a clean and honest harmony. The greatest duelist matched at last with the greatest wand. Tonight we follow that same slim length of dark wood onward, across the years, into other hands, colder and hungrier, and far less wise in the ways of the very power they grasped. For Lord Voldemort came, in the end, to want the Elder Wand more than almost anything, and he sought it, and he took it, and he held it high in the final battle, and yet it was never truly his. Herein lies perhaps the deepest lesson of our whole long weighing, and it is worth entering slowly and gently, the way one steps into cold water. Voldemort did not seek the Elder Wand out of ambition alone, or not at first. He sought it out of frustration, which is a smaller and more desperate thing. For there was one wizard he could not seem to kill, a mere boy who had escaped him again and again, and each time their wands met something strange and infuriating happened, and Voldemort was left thwarted and confused. And so he began to reason that the fault must lie in his own wand, that if only he had a greater wand, the greatest of all wands, then no protection, no strange accident, no boy's luck could stand against him. He set out after the legend, hunting down its history, seeking the wand that could not be beaten, because he believed it would at last give him the one thing his power had failed to secure, which was the death of the one enemy who kept slipping free. His hunt led him, in time, to a grave, for by then the Elder Wand had passed into the keeping of Albus Dumbledore, the same wizard who had won it from Grindelwald so long before, and Dumbledore now lay dead and buried. And Voldemort, in one of the coldest acts of a very cold life, broke open that white tomb and drew the wand from the still hand of the man who had lain there, and took it for himself, and felt, no doubt, a surge of triumph as its length settled into his fingers. He believed the greatest weapon in the world was his at last. He believed he had solved the riddle of his failures. He believed he was now, truly and finally, unbeatable. But he was wrong, and the manner of his wrongness is the whole of the matter. For the Elder Wand does not go to the one who holds it. It goes to the one who conquers its master. And Voldemort had conquered no one to gain it. He had taken it from a grave, from a dead hand, but the wand's allegiance had never belonged to the grave. Dumbledore had arranged his own death carefully, and had not been beaten in the way the wand understands. Indeed, some time before that death, Dumbledore had been disarmed by another wizard entirely, a young man named Draco Malfoy, who had struck the wand from his hand in a moment Draco himself scarcely understood. And so, without ever knowing it, without ever holding the Elder Wand at all, Draco Malfoy had become its true master, for he had conquered its keeper. The wand's loyalty had quietly slipped sideways, away from any grave, to a frightened boy who never dreamed of what he had won. Feel how strange and quiet that is. The most powerful wand in the world had changed hands without a single soul noticing, on the strength of a small and half-hearted disarming in a cold tower. And Voldemort, for all his cunning, for all his study of the wand's dark history, never grasped this hidden turning. He held the wand, but the wand did not hold him as its master. There was a gap between them, an emptiness where allegiance should have been, and he could not see it, because he had never truly understood what the wand was. He thought power was a thing you could seize by force and by cleverness. He did not understand that this particular power answered only to conquest fairly won, and that its loyalty could not be stolen from a tomb. And the matter grew stranger still, for for the true mastery moved yet again before the end. In the long flight and struggle of those final days, that same enemy boy, Harry, overpowered Draco Malfoy and took his ordinary wand from him in a plain and unmagical scuffle. And because the loyalty of the Elder Wand had lain with Draco, when Harry overcame Draco, the wand's allegiance passed once more, invisibly, across the miles, to Harry. So, by the time of the last battle, the wizard who truly commanded the Elder Wand was the very boy that Voldemort was trying to kill with it. The greatest weapon in the world raised against its own master. There is a terrible irony there, quiet and complete, and it would decide everything. When at last they faced each other in the great hall, in the pale light of morning, Voldemort lifted the Elder Wand and cast the killing curse he had cast so many times before, certain of his victory, certain that the unbeatable wand would not fail him. And the wand did not fail. It simply did what it had always been bound to do. It would not turn its full power against its own true master. The curse rebounded, and Voldemort, who had torn his soul to shreds to escape death, who had murdered and schemed and hunted across half a lifetime to make himself deathless, fell at last, undone not by a greater force, but by a rule he had never troubled to understand. Now let us set this beside the tale of last night, and weigh the two, softly and fairly. Grindelwald won the wand by the wand's own law, and mastered it, and wielded its full power for years, and lost it only to a greater wizard in fair and open combat. There was no gap between him and the wand. When it left him, it left cleanly. Voldemort, by contrast, took the wand but never conquered its master, held it but was never held by it, wielded a hollow version of its power, and was destroyed by the very weapon he believed had made him invincible. Grindelwald mastered the wand. The wand, in the end, mastered Voldemort. And there is something in this that speaks to the whole question of which of them was truly the greater, something deeper than any list of spells or feats. For power is not only a matter of how much force one can summon, it is also a matter of understanding, of knowing the nature of the thing you hold. Grindelwald, whatever his cruelties, understood the wand he carried. Voldemort, for all his prodigious gifts, did not. He was in so many ways the more extreme sorcerer, the one who split his soul and conquered death itself for a time and made a whole nation flinch at his name. And yet when he reached for the oldest and subtlest of powers, he grasped it as a thief grasps a coin by the shine of it without ever knowing what it truly was. His blindness to love had already been his flaw, and here it wore another face, a blindness to the quiet laws that govern the deepest magic. So perhaps we may say this gently as the night grows deep. On the single through line of the Elder Wand, the wand that binds these two men across the years, Grindelwald stands as its master and Voldemort as its unwitting servant. The one earned and understood the power he held. The other seized it and was undone by it. And that, more than any duel or any feat of raw magic, may be the truest measure of the difference between them. That one man knew what he wielded, and the other only thought he did. Let that settle over you now, slow and complete, like the last light leaving a still room. The wand that could not be beaten, and the two very different men who reached for it, and the quiet, patient rules that neither force nor fear could ever overturn. Hold it loosely, this old and gentle lesson, and let it drift away with everything else, out into the soft and waiting dark. As your thoughts grow still, and your breathing grows slow, and the long night folds itself kindly around you. Now that we have weighed their raw magic and their dueling, their followers and their fear, and the strange thread of the Elder Wand that runs between them, we come to something quieter and, in its own way, more revealing than any spell. We come to the question of what they wanted. For power is never only a matter of how much a wizard can lift, or burn, or break. It is also a matter of where all that force is pointed and why. Two men can each carry a storm inside them, and yet one turns that storm toward the world and the other turns it inward against the one enemy he can never quite reach. Tonight, as you settle and let your breath grow slow and even, we hold these two dark hearts up to the soft light and simply look at what lived inside them, the dream that each one served. Begin with Gellert Grindelwald, for his goal is easier to say aloud and stranger to sit with. Grindelwald did not, at his core, want money, and he did not want comfort, and he did not even want, in the smallest and meanest sense, revenge. What Grindelwald wanted was a new world. He looked at the way wizards lived, hidden away in the shadows, frightened of discovery, forced to shrink themselves so that ordinary people would never know what they truly were, and he found that hiding intolerable. He believed that magic was a gift too great to be kept secret, and that those who carried it were meant to lead rather than to cower. And so he dreamed of lifting the veil, of bringing the wizarding world out of its long concealment and setting it above the Muggle one, with wizards as guardians and rulers over those who could not do magic. He wrapped this dream in 3 soft and terrible words, for the greater good, and he meant those words. That is the frightening part. He did not think of himself as cruel. He thought of himself as necessary. He believed that the suffering along the way, the fear and the fallen, and even the death, was a small price for the brighter order waiting on the far side of it. There is a kind of tyrant who is honestly convinced he is a savior, and Grindelwald was that kind. As a very young man, in the long golden summer he spent beside Albus Dumbledore in Godric's Hollow, the two of them turned this dream over between them like a bright coin. And for a little while, even Dumbledore was dazzled by it. They imagined themselves the leaders of a gentle revolution, taking up the Deathly Hallows as their symbols and their tools, remaking the whole shape of the world. It was a young man's dream, grand and glittering and utterly certain of itself, and it did not stop to count who would be crushed underneath it. When their friendship broke in that dreadful 3-cornered duel, and Dumbledore's sister Ariana fell in the crossfire, the dream did not die with her. Dumbledore turned away from it in grief and in horror. Grindelwald carried it on across a continent. He built a movement. He gathered followers who did not merely fear him, but believed in him, who wanted what he wanted, who looked at his vision of a world set right and felt their own hearts leap. That is the shape of an idealist who becomes a tyrant. He offered people not just safety, but meaning. And meaning is the most intoxicating thing one person can offer another. Now turn, slowly, and look at Lord Voldemort, and feel at once how different the air becomes. Voldemort also spoke the language of a cause. He raised the banner of pure blood, of the cleansing of those he called unworthy, of a wizarding world purified and set under the rule of the strong. He gathered his Death Eaters and gave them a doctrine to march behind. And yet, if you look closely at Tom Riddle, if you hold the lamp near and study the boy who became the monster, you begin to suspect that the cause was never truly the point. The pure blood doctrine was a robe he wore, useful because it drew followers and gave their cruelty a name, but underneath the robe was a hunger far older and far more private. What Voldemort wanted, above every other thing, was not a new world. It was for himself never to end. He was afraid of death. He had been afraid of it since he was a small boy in a bleak orphanage, and that fear grew inside him like a root-splitting stone, until it had cracked apart everything else a person is meant to be. This is the great difference in their goals, and it is worth resting on gently because it says almost everything. Grindelwald looked outward. His dream was too large for one lifetime, too large for one country, a dream about all wizards and all muggles and the whole arrangement of the world. Whether that dream was noble or monstrous, and it was monstrous, it was at least a dream that pointed away from himself, towards something he imagined for everyone. Voldemort looked inward. His dream, in the end, could fit inside a single skull. It was that Tom Riddle should not die. Everything else, the conquests, the terror, the followers, the war, was scaffolding built around that one small and desperate wish. He split his own soul into 7 ragged pieces and hid them across the world. And he did this not to build anything and not to lift anyone, but only to bind himself to life by force, to make the ending that comes for all of us unable to come for him. There is something almost unbearably lonely in it. The greatest dark wizard of his age poured all his enormous power into the single project of never letting go. And so we can say, softly and fairly, that these were 2 kinds of tyrant, and they cast very different shadows. Grindelwald was the idealist tyrant, the man who wanted to remake the world and was willing to drown it to do so. A man who could stand before a crowd and make them weep for a future he alone could see. His evil wore the mask of hope, and that mask is part of why he was so dangerous, because hope draws people in where fear only drives them away. Voldemort was the death-fearing tyrant, the man who wanted, beneath all his grand and hateful words, only to rule forever, because ruling forever meant living forever. His evil wore the mask of strength, but behind the strength was terror, the oldest terror there is, the child's terror of the dark and of not being anymore. You might wonder which of these is the more powerful goal, and it is a soft and pleasant thing to wonder about as sleep gathers around you. In one way, Grindelwald's aim was larger, for it reached across nations and imagined the whole world reordered, and a dream that vast can move millions and topple governments. In another way, Voldemort's aim was more absolute, for a man who has decided he will not die will do anything at all, will cross any line, will unmake his own soul, because he has removed from himself the one boundary that keeps most people human. An idealist can sometimes be reasoned with, can sometimes be shown a gentler road to his shining city. But a man running from death runs past every argument, because to him the alternative is simply to stop existing, and against that fear no persuasion has any weight. There is one last quiet thing to notice before we let this thought drift away. Grindelwald, for all his cruelty, wanted a world he would then live in, a world of order and rule and wizard's ascendant, and that meant he still cared, in his cold way, about how the world was arranged. Voldemort did not truly care how the world was arranged, so long as he was in it forever. The one wanted to be a king in a kingdom he had built. The other only wanted never to close his eyes. And perhaps that is why, of the two, Voldemort feels the emptier, the hollower, the more purely afraid. A vast dark power built around a single small and frightened wish, spinning on and on in the night, wanting nothing in all the wide world except not to end. Every great power has, somewhere within it, a small door that will not lock, and it is through that door that the ending finally walks in. This is true of storms, and of empires, and of dark wizards, and it is true of both the men we have been weighing tonight. So let us turn now, slowly and without any hurry, to the way each of them fell. For the manner of a downfall tells you as much about a person as the manner of a rise, and there is something strangely soothing in tracing how even the mightiest come, at last, to their quiet or their terrible end. Let your shoulders loosen, Let the pillow take the weight of your head, and come with me to the two endings. Gellert Grindelwald fell first, in 1945, and he fell in the oldest and cleanest way that a wizard can fall, which is that a greater wizard beat him. For years he had spread his terror across Europe, gathering followers and building his prison fortress of Nurmengard, and carrying the Elder Wand, that unbeatable wand, so that no duelist in the world seemed able to stand against him. And yet all the while there was one man he would not face, one man he had loved and lost in the summer of his youth, and that was Albus Dumbledore. The two of them had made a promise once, a boyish blood pact never to fight each other, and whether it was that old pact or something deeper, some grief neither could speak, they circled each other for decades without ever meeting. But the terror grew too great to ignore, and at last Dumbledore went to him. What followed is remembered in the wizarding world as the greatest duel that has ever been fought, a duel so tremendous that those who tried to describe it afterward could hardly find the words. And when the light and the fire had faded, it was Grindelwald who stood defeated, and Dumbledore who held the field, and the Elder Wand passed from the Dark Master to the man who had beaten him. Consider what undid Grindelwald there, because it is a gentle irony and worth turning over. He was beaten in fair combat, wand against wand, by someone simply more skilled and more whole than he was. But look a little closer, and you find that what he could not understand was not a spell or a strategy, it was a heart. Grindelwald had built his whole life on the belief that love was a weakness, that attachment was a chain to be broken, that a truly great wizard rose above such small and human things. And it was precisely love, Dumbledore's grief-hardened, sister-haunted, decades-tempered love, that produced the one wizard who could match him. Grindelwald could not understand a man who was made stronger, not weaker, by what he had lost. He was defeated by a quality he had spent his life dismissing, and that is the first door that would not lock. He was imprisoned then in Nurmengard, the very fortress he had raised for his own enemies, and there, high in a cold stone tower, he sat for the long remainder of his years. And there is a second ending inside his ending, a strange and quiet coda that we should not pass by. Many years later, when Lord Voldemort came hunting the Elder Wand and traced its history back to that old tower, he found Grindelwald there, aged and unarmed and utterly without power, a broken old man with nothing left to bargain with. And Grindelwald, who had once wished to rule the world, did a curious thing. He did not grovel. He did not trade away the secret to save his own skin. Faced with the most feared wizard of a new age, this ruined idealist stood on the last scrap of his pride and defied him, mocking him even, refusing to help him toward the hollow he craved. And for that defiance, Voldemort killed him. It is a small thing, set against a lifetime of cruelty, and it does not wash any of that cruelty away. But it is a real thing. At the very end, stripped of every wand and every follower and every dream, Grindelwald found somewhere inside himself a flicker of courage, and he chose to die rather than to serve. Perhaps the long years in the tower had worked some slow change in him. We are left only to wonder, softly, in the dark. Now let the scene shift, and let us follow the second and later downfall, the fall of Lord Voldemort at the Battle of Hogwarts in 1998. His ending was not clean, and it was not fair in the old dueling sense, and it did not come from a wizard greater than himself in raw power. It came instead from the two things he had spent his entire existence refusing to understand, and here the pattern that runs through both these men shows itself most clearly of all. Each fell to what he could not understand. For Grindelwald, it was love in a single wizard. For Voldemort, it was love as a force woven through the whole world, and beside it, the quiet, lawful logic of the Elder Wand. Think of how Voldemort met his end. He had chased the Elder Wand at last, believing that this legendary object was the missing key, the thing that would finally let him kill the boy who kept slipping from his grasp. He murdered the man he thought was its master, and he took the wand from a dead hand, and he believed himself now invincible. But the wand did not agree. Its allegiance had never truly been his, for its loyalty had passed along a hidden path he never bothered to trace. From one wizard to another, by the quiet rules of disarming and defeat, until it belonged, in the end, to Harry. Voldemort held the most powerful wand in the world, and it would not fight for him, because he had never understood that a wand is not a weapon you simply seize, but a loyalty you must earn. He was too proud, too certain, too dismissive of the small and subtle magics of ownership and consent. That was the first door left open, and the second, the deeper one, was love, the very thing that Grindelwald had also failed to see. Voldemort had never once been loved, and had never once loved, and so he could not recognize love when it stood before him and worked its oldest magic. He did not understand that a mother could die to shield her child and leave behind a protection no curse could pierce. He did not understand that Harry would walk willingly to his own death and, in doing so, cast the same ancient shield over everyone he was dying to protect. He did not understand that his own curse, rebounding, would strike no one but himself. He had made himself, as he thought, the master of death through his Horcruxes, and yet death came for him in the end through the one country of the heart he had never set foot in. The greatest killer of his age was undone not by a greater killer, but by a boy who was willing to stop fighting, and by a wand that quietly refused him, and by love, which he had spent a lifetime calling weak. It is worth pausing here, as the night deepens, on how strange it is that a wizard so obsessed with mastering death should have understood so little about the small, quiet rules by which the deepest magic actually works. Voldemort had studied darkness more deeply than almost anyone who ever lived. He knew curses and poisons and the mutilation of the soul, and yet the older, softer magics slipped entirely past him because they lived in a room of the world he refused to enter. The loyalty of a wand, given freely and won by honest defeat, is a small and courteous thing, almost a kind of good manners between wizard and object, and he had no patience for courtesy. The sacrifice of a mother, the willingness of a boy to lay down his life, these were tender things, and he had trained himself to sneer at tenderness. So he walked into his final battle carrying the greatest wand in the world and the greatest confidence in the world, and both of them were hollow, because both of them rested on a kind of magic he had chosen, long ago, never to learn. There is a lesson in that so gentle it barely needs saying, that a person can grow enormously wise in one direction and stay utterly blind in another, and that the blindness is often the more dangerous of the two. And so we lay the two downfalls side by side, and we find them rhyming softly across the years. Grindelwald, who thought love a weakness, was beaten by a man made strong by love. Voldemort, who thought love a weakness, was beaten by love itself, running like a hidden current beneath the whole world. Each had a door that would not lock, and each had spent his life pretending that door did not exist. And perhaps this is the gentlest lesson to carry down into sleep, that the thing a person most refuses to understand is very often the thing that will one day come quietly to find him. Rest now, and let the two towers stand empty in your mind, and let the fires cool. And so at last we come to the question we set out to weigh, the question the title of this long, quiet night has held before you all along. Which of these two dark wizards was truly the more powerful. We have gathered everything we need. We have looked at their origins and their rise, at their raw magic and their dueling, at their followers and the fear they cast, at the elder wand that binds them, and at the dreams that drove them and the doors through which they fell. Now we lay all of it out gently, like smooth stones on a dark cloth, and we turn them over one final time. And I will tell you now, so that you may relax and stop bracing for a verdict, that we will not end this with a shout or a winner crowned. We will end it the way the honest weighing of two vast and terrible things ought to end, softly, with respect for how the scale trembles. Let us begin by giving Grindelwald his due, fully and without grudging it. On the pure art of the wand, on dueling itself, he stands very near the summit of all wizard kind. He carried the elder wand and made himself, for a long span of years, all but unbeatable, and the duel that finally brought him down is remembered as the greatest ever fought, which is a way of saying that only the very greatest wizard alive could manage it, and even then, only barely. That is a towering thing. And beyond the duel there is his charisma, which was a power of its own, a magic that needed no wand at all. He could stand before a crowd and turn strangers into believers, could sway not only individuals but whole movements across whole nations, could make people long for the world he promised even as it darkened. Fear can drive people, but longing pulls them, and Grindelwald knew how to make people long. In dueling and in charisma, in the ability to master the greatest wand and to move the hearts of thousands, the scale tips toward Gellert Grindelwald, and we should say so plainly. Now give Voldemort his due in turn, and it is a different kind of weight, and in some ways a heavier one. When we speak of raw dark achievement, of the sheer extremity of the magic he mastered, Voldemort stands somewhere almost no other wizard has ever stood. He flew without a broom or any aid, a feat so rare that those who saw it could scarcely believe their eyes. He wielded the killing curse as easily as breathing. He slipped into other minds and bent them, spoke to serpents, commanded monsters, and above all of that, he did the thing that even Grindelwald, for all his hunger for the Hollows, never dared to do. He tore his own soul into pieces and scattered them across the world to cheat death itself, and by doing so, he made himself, for a time, nearly impossible to kill. That is not merely power. That is a category of dark accomplishment that sits alone. And laid over all of it is the terror, the pure and absolute dread he pressed upon a whole society, until his very name could not be spoken aloud, until a single word could empty a room and stop a heart. On raw magical extremity, on immortality, and on sheer suffocating fear, the scale tips toward Lord Voldemort, and we should say that plainly too. So you see how it goes. Lift one side and Grindelwald rises, the duelist and the dreamer, the master of the wand and the mover of nations. Lift the other and Voldemort rises, the soul splitter and the death cheater, the terror without a name. The scale does not settle, it swings, and swings back, and hangs trembling in the balance, and I think if you press it honestly, it will not come to rest on either side. And rather than fret at that, I would like you to feel how restful it actually is. Not every question is built to have one clean answer, and this is one of the good ones that is not. Because both of these men were extraordinary, and both were monstrous. And they were extraordinary and monstrous in ways that do not truly convert into one another. You cannot really ask whether the greatest duelist is more powerful than the man who conquered death, any more than you can ask whether the deepest ocean is taller than the highest mountain. They are measured on different lines. If you were to press me, gently, in the dark, for something more than a shrug, I would offer you this, not as a law, but as one soft opinion among many. Grindelwald may well have been the more gifted wizard in the oldest and purest sense, the more natural master of magic as an art, the finer duelist, the more magnetic soul. But Voldemort was, I think, the more powerful force, because he had removed from himself every limit that holds most beings back. He feared nothing except death, and he had gone further than anyone to escape even that, and a person with no limit and no fear and no love to soften him becomes a kind of engine that does not stop. Grindelwald, for all his brilliance, still lived inside the world, still wanted things within it, still had a self that could be reasoned with, and, at the very end, even a flicker of conscience. Voldemort had hollowed himself out until almost nothing remained but the will to continue. The more beautiful wizard, perhaps, was Grindelwald. The more unstoppable one, perhaps, was Voldemort, and you may hold those two thoughts at once without ever having to choose between them. We should also let the matter of their followers rest gently on the scale, because power is not only what a wizard can do alone in an empty room, it is also what he can move in others. And here again the two of them balance in ways that resist a simple answer. Grindelwald's reach spread wide across a whole continent, a great slow tide of belief that rose in one country and then another, carried not by chains but by conviction. He gathered those who wanted to be gathered, who heard his vision and felt it answer some hunger in themselves. And a movement built on longing can grow to a size that a movement built on fear never quite reaches, because fear must be maintained at every point, while belief spreads on its own. Voldemort's grip was narrower, but far tighter, a fist closed hard around one nation. He did not ask to be believed in. He demanded to be dreaded, and he was, so completely, that ordinary people policed their own thoughts and lowered their own voices without his ever needing to be in the room. The one commanded through the heart and the other through the throat, and if you ask which hold is stronger, you find yourself once more at a scale that will not settle. For the wide warm tide and the tight cold fist are simply two different ways for one will to press upon many. There is one more way to weigh them that is kinder than either, and I will leave it with you last of all, because it makes the softest resting place. Consider that they were terrible in different directions, like two different kinds of winter. Grindelwald was the bright cold, the dazzling frost that draws you to the window because it is beautiful, and only later do you feel how it can kill. Voldemort was the dark cold, the deep and starless freeze of the longest night. That does not tempt you at all, but simply takes the warmth from the room. One drew people in with light, one drove them down with dread. To ask which winter is stronger is to ask a question the seasons themselves would not bother to answer, because each is complete, each is fearsome, each in its own way is the whole of what cold can be. So let the scale hang where it hangs, trembling and honest and unresolved, and let that be enough. We came tonight to weigh two of the darkest wizards who ever lived, and we have weighed them truly. And we have found them to be terrible in different measures that no single number can hold. There is no defeat in leaving it there. There is only the quiet dignity of a fair mind that has looked at two vast, dark things and refused to pretend they are simpler than they are. Let the question rest now, unanswered and untroubling, like a lantern set down at the end of a long walk. You do not need to solve it to sleep. You only need to set it down and let the two names hang in the dark air, weighed and understood as far as understanding will go, and no farther. And that is a soft and pleasant place for the mind to lie down and be still. And now our long night draws gently toward its close, and there is nothing left to weigh, nothing left to measure, nothing left to prove. We have walked the whole length of it together, From the two towers standing dark against the sky at the very beginning, through the rise of one wizard and then the other, through their magic and their duels, their followers and their fear, the wand that ran between them like a silver thread, the dreams that drove them, and the quiet doors through which each of them finally fell. It has been a long walk, and you have carried it well, and now the only thing left to do is to set it all down and let it settle, the way snow settles over a still landscape once the wind has gone. So let the two names settle now. Let them drift down slowly out of the dark and come to rest. Gellert Grindelwald, the bright and terrible dreamer, the duelist who nearly could not be beaten, the man who wanted to remake the whole world and drowned so much of it in the trying. Now only a memory in a cold stone tower, the frost that dazzled and then killed. And Lord Voldemort, the death-fearing tyrant, the soul torn into pieces and scattered, the name that could not be spoken, the dark and starless cold that took the warmth from every room it entered, now also only a memory, undone at last by the one country of the heart he never entered. Two vast and dreadful powers, weighed as fairly as we knew how, and found terrible in different measures. Let them settle. Let them lie quiet. There is nothing more they can do tonight, and nothing more you need to think about them. And perhaps that is the quiet truth this whole long night has been circling toward, that the question of who was more powerful matters far less, in the end, than what all that power was spent upon. Here were two of the most gifted wizards the world has ever produced, each holding within himself enough magic to reshape nations, and each poured that vast gift into ruin. One into a dream that crushed everyone beneath it, one into a terror that hollowed him out from within. Think how differently their stories might have run had that same power turned toward gentleness, toward mending rather than breaking, toward the small, warm, ordinary goods that neither of them ever learned to value. It is not a thought to trouble you, only a soft and passing one. The kind of thought that drifts through the mind at the very edge of sleep and then dissolves. Great power is only ever a question, and the answer is what you do with it. And both of these men answered wrongly, and both of them lost everything, and now they are only names settling into the dark. Feel how the question itself has grown soft. When we began, it stood before us sharp and insistent. Which of them was truly the more powerful? And now, having looked at everything, we have let it become a gentle thing, a thing that does not need an answer, a lantern set down at the end of the road. You do not have to decide. The scale may hang trembling and unresolved for as long as it likes, and that is not a failure, but a kind of peace. The greatest gift of a fair mind is that it can hold two great things at once and let them both be true. Grindelwald the more beautiful wizard, perhaps. Voldemort the more unstoppable force, perhaps. Both terrible. Both extraordinary. Neither one needing to win. Here in the quiet, where winning does not matter at all. And notice, as your breathing slows, how far away all of it feels now. The duels and the dark magic, the fear that once gripped whole nations, the towers and the fortresses and the wands. They belong to stories, and stories are the safest place in all the world for terrible things to live. They cannot reach you here. You are warm, and you are held by the dark, and the only towers near you now are the soft ones your own quiet mind is building, the ones that fade even as they rise. Let the fires cool. Let the great duels grow dim and distant. Let every fierce and frightening thing we spoke of tonight sink down beneath the surface of your thoughts like stones settling to the bottom of a still pond, until the water above them goes smooth and clear and untroubled. Think, for one last soft moment, of how far these two traveled and how little either of them found. Grindelwald reached for a whole new world, and ended his days in a single cold room in a tower he had built for other men, with nothing but the memory of a summer long ago when someone had loved him and he had thrown that love away. Voldemort reached for endless life and found instead the smallest and loneliest of endings, undone in a single instant by the very forces he had spent a lifetime scorning. For all their terrible power, neither one arrived anywhere worth arriving. And there is a strange comfort in that, the way there is comfort in watching a storm finally blow itself out over the sea, leaving the water calm and gray and gentle in the morning light. The mightiest darkness spends itself in the end. It always spends itself in the end. And what remains, when it has gone, is only the quiet, and the quiet is where you are now. So carry nothing of them with you into sleep. They have had their long telling, and they are finished, and they ask nothing further of you. Let them be two old stories on a high shelf, the covers closed, the pages still, gathering the soft dust of all the nights to come. You have understood them as well as anyone needs to, and understanding is its own kind of laying to rest. There is no fear left in them now, not here, not for you. There is only the shape of a tale that has reached its ending, and the pleasant heaviness that comes when a long story is done, and the listener may finally close the eyes. Let the room around you grow soft at its edges. Let the weight of the day, and the weight of this long tale, and the weight of every small worry you have been carrying, all of it grow lighter now, and lighter still, as though someone were quietly lifting each burden from you one by one and setting it aside until morning. You do not need any of it tonight. You need only the slow rise and fall of your own breathing, the warmth gathered around you, the deepening hush. Everything else can wait. Everything else will keep. There is nothing in this whole quiet hour that asks anything of you at all. There is nothing left to do but rest. You have followed two of the darkest wizards who ever lived all the way to their endings, and you have weighed them wisely and gently. And now you may lay that whole long story aside. Let your hands grow heavy. Let your shoulders sink into the warmth beneath you. Let the last threads of thought loosen and drift, the names growing fainter, the images softening, the whole quiet weight of the night gathering you in. The two names have settled now, like snow over Nurmengard, like snow over dark and empty towers, white and silent and utterly still, covering everything, softening everything, until there is only the hush. Breathe in, slowly, and let it go. There is nowhere you need to be, and nothing you need to carry. The long weighing is done. The scale hangs quiet. The story is closed and set gently on its shelf. You are safe, and you are warm, and the night is holding you kindly. And sleep is very near now, closer with each slow breath. Let it come. Let it take you softly down beneath the smooth, still water, past the settled stones, into the deep and dreamless quiet where nothing is fearsome and nothing must be weighed and nothing is asked of you at all. Rest now. Rest deeply. Let the two names fade into the dark, and let the dark be gentle, and let yourself drift all the way down into sleep. Sleep well. Good night.